Elias Whitmore didn't knock. He never knocked. He walked into Marlowe's house the morning after her husband's burial like he owned the floor beneath her feet, because in his mind he already did. He set his hat on the table she had just cleared of funeral dishes, looked at May standing in the doorway with her arms around her little sister, and said, without a trace of grief, for the brother he'd just put in the ground, "Those girls are coming with me. You can fight it or you can make it easy. Either way, they're mine now." Marlowe didn't scream, cry. She had already cried everything she had. She looked at Elias Whitmore, at his clean boots and his cold eyes, and she understood with absolute clarity that she had perhaps 2 weeks before he made good on it. So she started packing that same night. If you've ever had to choose between staying somewhere familiar and dangerous or running somewhere unknown and terrifying, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel and follow Marlowe's story to the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Hit like, leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter had taken 11 days to reach Silas Boone in Wyoming, and another 4 before he wrote back. He was not a man who wasted words, and his reply to the Missouri Matrimonial Agency showed it. Widower, 41, working cattle, ranch, 340 acres outside Laramie. Looking for a woman who isn't afraid of cold or hard work. I don't need someone decorative. I need someone real. The agency had forwarded a dozen responses to various ranchers that season. Only one woman wrote back to Silas. Her name was Marlowe Bennett, and her letter was 3 pages long. She wrote about her late husband, Thomas, who had died of fever the previous spring. She wrote about Missouri winters and how she had learned to repair a roof gutter in January, because there was no one else to do it. She wrote that she wasn't looking for romance in the storybook sense. She was looking for a life that made sense. Told him she was 34, that she had worked a garden plot since she was 9 years old, and that she could make a meal out of almost nothing. She did not mention May. She did not mention Nell. Marlowe had written and rewritten that letter 4 times. The version she sent was the one that left the children out. She told herself she would explain in person, that once he saw her answers, he understood that she wasn't helpless, that she could pull her own weight, and more, he would listen. She told herself a lot of things in those weeks. She wasn't entirely sure she believed any of them. What she believed without question was that Elias Whitmore was not going to stop. He had already spoken to a lawyer in Jefferson City. He had already told their neighbors with practiced sadness that his poor sister-in-law was struggling and that the children needed a stable home. He was building a case the way men like him built everything quietly, patiently, using other people's words and other people's sympathy, until the walls were already up, before anyone noticed they were being enclosed. Marlowe had grown up poor enough to understand that the law was not a neutral thing. It bent toward men with money. It bent away from widows. She booked the stagecoach to Wyoming with $31, 2 cloth bags, and 2 daughters she was going to have to explain to a man who had no idea they existed. May was 8 years old and had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness. She had been the one to fold the blankets when Marlowe started packing. Not asking why, just folding. She understood, in the way children sometimes do, that her mother had made a decision and that the time for questions had passed. Packed her own small bag without being told. A dress, her sewing kit, a book with the cover falling off. Nell was 5. Nell didn't entirely understand what was happening, only that they were leaving, and she was allowed to bring her stones. Nell had been collecting stones since she was 3. She had a particular fondness for the striped ones, gray and white and sometimes faintly pink, and she kept them in a cotton pouch she wore tied to her belt. Clinked softly whenever she walked. Marlowe had made peace with the sound. It was better than crying. The stagecoach left St. Joseph on a Tuesday morning in November. The driver, a weathered man named Gerald Potts, who had made the Laramie run 30 times, told Marlowe the weather looked clear. It did not stay clear. The storm came up out of nowhere on the 3rd day, which was the kind of thing people said about Wyoming blizzards because it was simply true. There was wind, and then there was more wind, and then the sky dropped, and the world disappeared. Gerald Potts had seen worse. He told the 3 passengers, Marlowe, the girls, and a traveling fabric merchant named Hatch, that they would push through to the way station. He had done it before. He did not make it to the way station. The lead horse went down first, lunging sideways in a drift that had no business being that deep that fast, and the momentum jackknifed the coach hard enough to throw Hatch against the door frame. Marlowe grabbed both girls before they could slide. Coach tilted, held, then settled at an ugly angle. Outside, Gerald Potts was shouting something about the wheel. Then the second horse panicked. The brake harness gave way, which was either old leather or bad luck or both, and the remaining horses bolted into the white. Gerald was pulled halfway before he let go, and then he was on the ground, and then the sound of the horses was gone entirely. Marlowe opened the coach door into a wall of wind that hit her face like a thrown bucket of ice water. She could see approximately 4 feet in front of her. Gerald Potts was lying in the snow with his hand pressed to his chest. Hatch, bleeding from his forehead, climbed out and knelt beside him. The driver didn't speak again after that. Hatch looked up at Marlowe with the kind of blankness that comes over a person when the situation has exceeded every category they had prepared for. He was a fabric merchant from Kansas City. He sold calico and wool batting. He had no idea what to do. "I need to get my daughters warm," Marlowe said. It wasn't a request, it was just a fact she was stating out loud. Coach provided some shelter, but not enough. The angle it sat at meant the wind found the gaps in the door, and the cold came in steady and mean. Nell had stopped shivering, which Marlowe knew was worse than shivering. She pulled her youngest tight against her, under both their coats, and felt the child's skin, and felt her heart do something complicated, an animal that she didn't have words for. May was watching her mother's face. "She's going to be okay," May said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Marlowe said. She looked out through the gap in the door. The snow was so thick it was nearly opaque. She could not see a road. She could not see anything that suggested direction or distance or civilization. Then barely visible a light. Not the way station. Too close and to the wrong side. A window light. Someone's house. Someone's ranch. Someone's something. And it was small and distant, and probably a quarter-mile away through drifts that would come up to her waist. Marlowe looked at Hatch. "Stay with her," she said, meaning May. "I'll come," he started. "Stay with my daughter." Her voice left no room for discussion. She pulled Nell out of the coach and against her chest, wrapped the child in everything extra she had, and walked into the storm. She fell twice. The first time she caught herself on her knees and kept moving. The second time she went down completely and Nell made a small, frightened sound, and Marlowe thought, "Not here, not like this. I did not get us this far to stop here," and she got back up. The light was real. It didn't disappear, didn't flicker out. It was just there, steady and yellow through a window, and she kept her eyes on it and walked. She did not know how long it took. She did not look back to see if May was following, because she could not afford to lose the light. Porch steps were nearly buried. She climbed them on her hands and one knee because she was holding Nell with both arms, and she had no other choice. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again harder with the flat of her fist. Silas Boone had been asleep in the chair by the fire, which was where he fell asleep most winter evenings, because he hadn't been able to sleep properly in a bed since Eleanor died. He heard the first knock and thought it was a shutter. He heard the second knock and sat upright. Nobody knocked at this ranch in a blizzard. Nobody was out in this. He crossed the room in 4 steps and pulled the door open. The woman standing on his porch was barely recognizable as a person. She was plastered in snow, her coat soaked through, her hair coming loose in frozen strips. She was holding a child against her chest, a small child who was not moving. Silas said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Stepped back and let her in. Marlowe moved past him without speaking and went straight to the fireplace. She got down on her knees and held Nell close to the heat, pulling the wet coat away and pressing the child's hands between her own. Silas stood 2 feet behind her, still processing what he was looking at. "She's cold," Marlowe said, which was obvious, but she said anyway, because she needed to say something. "Too cold." Silas went to the chest against the wall and pulled out a wool blanket that had been Eleanor's heavy, well-made, something he hadn't touched in over a year. He brought it to the woman on the floor and held it out. Took it without looking at him and wrapped it around Nell in 3 quick practiced motions. "There's another child," Marlowe said. Her voice had an edge on it that wasn't panic, but was sitting right next to it. Coming from the coach, quarter-mile east, older girl, 8 years old. Silas grabbed his coat from the hook by the door before she finished the sentence. It took him 11 minutes to get to the coach, and back he knew the land well enough to move in it, even blind, which was the only advantage the blizzard couldn't take from him. He found May standing beside the overturned coach, with a blanket from inside, wrapped around her shoulders, watching the direction her mother had gone, with an expression no 8-year-old should have on her face. "Your mother sent me," Silas said. May looked at him, really looked at him, the way a child looks at a stranger when they're deciding in 3 seconds whether he's worth trusting. She had gray eyes and a set to her jaw, that reminded Silas incongruously of his own mother. "Nell's warm?" May asked. "Getting there." May nodded once and came with him. She didn't take his hand. She walked beside him through the drifts, keeping pace without complaint. He brought her back to the ranch house, and Hatch the fabric merchant followed, half frozen and grateful in the excessive way of a man who had not expected to survive the evening. The next hour was practical and grim in the way emergencies always are. Silas built up the fire. He found dry clothes, a shirt and spare trousers of his own that drowned the woman completely, and a blanket-wrapped situation for the smaller girl that was more suggestion than clothing. He heated broth from what was left in the pot. He didn't ask questions. May sat beside her sister and watched Nell's color come back with the focused attention of someone who had done this before, beside someone in crisis, and monitored them, steady and quiet. It was only after Nell had fallen into a real sleep, her breathing even, her hands warm, that Silas finally sat down across the room and looked at Marlowe properly for the first time. It was not what he'd imagined. This was not a complaint. It was simply an observation. He had a letter. The letter described a practical woman who could fix gutters. He had constructed some vague image from that, the way people do, and then the door had opened, and the image had ceased to matter because the reality was more specific and more complicated and considerably more difficult. "You're the woman from Missouri," he said. Marlowe looked up from the fire. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her jaw had a bruise forming from something in the crash. She looked tired in the way people look when they've been tired for months, and the emergency has only temporarily disguised it. "Yes," she said. "Marlowe Bennett." "Yes." He looked at the sleeping child by the fire. He looked at May, who had fallen asleep sitting upright, with her back against the wall, her chin dropped to her chest. He looked back at Marlowe. "You have children," he said. It wasn't an accusation yet. It was just a sentence. But they both knew what was underneath it. Marlowe held his gaze. She was clearly exhausted, clearly aware of exactly what she had done by omitting them from every letter, clearly not about to pretend otherwise. Whatever she wasn't a good liar. She might be a woman who had chosen to leave things out. That was different. "2 daughters," she said. "May is 8. Nell just turned 5. Silas nodded once, said nothing. "I know what you're thinking," Marlowe said. "I doubt that. You're thinking I deceived you. Did you?" She was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind was the loudest thing in the world. "I left them out of the letters." "Yes. I was going to tell you when I arrived." I knew. She stopped. Started again. "I knew a rancher looking for a wife wouldn't necessarily want to take on another man's children. Did it occur to you that I should have been allowed to make that decision for myself?" "It occurred to me every day since I sent the first letter," she said. "Yes." Silas studied her for a long moment. He was a man who had learned through considerable loss that anger was only useful when you could do something with it. Right now there was nothing to do. There was a blizzard and a sleeping child, and a woman who had walked through a Wyoming storm carrying her daughter. And whatever else was true or false about the situation, those facts were simply what they were. "We'll talk about it when the storm passes," he said. Marlowe nodded. "Sleep," he said. "You can have the chair. I'll take the floor." She started to object, and he looked at her once, and she stopped objecting. Storm ran for 2 days. In those 2 days, Silas discovered several things about Marlowe Bennett that he had not expected and could not dismiss. The first morning, he woke before dawn to find she had already stoked the fire, started a pot, and located a crack in the chinking on the north wall that had been letting cold in for probably 3 winters. She had stuffed it temporarily with scraps of cloth from her bag and was examining the rest of the wall with the focused expression of someone who was mentally pricing repairs. Stood in the doorway, watching her do this. She noticed him and straightened. "The chinking on the north wall is failing in at least 4 places. You're losing heat you can't afford to lose in winter. I'm aware. Are you going to fix it?" He looked at the wall. The honest answer was that he hadn't gotten around to it, which was a thing he hadn't said out loud to another adult in some time. "Hadn't yet. I can help fix it," she said. "If you have the materials." It wasn't an offer designed to impress him. It was just practical. She was assessing the house the way she probably assessed everything, for what was wrong and what needed doing. He found the lime and sand in the supply shed. She mixed it herself, without asking for instruction, and spent 2 hours on the north wall, while May handed her tools with the efficiency of a girl who had clearly helped her mother with repairs before. Nell followed Silas around the barn while he fed the cattle, asking questions in the unfiltered way 5-year-olds do. "Why do cows make that sound? Do they know they're cold? What's his name?" "That one." The one with the spot. Don't have a name, Silas said. Nell considered this. He looks like a Herman. Silas didn't answer, but he noticed, 2 hours later, that he was thinking of the spotted one as Herman, which was irritating. By the end of the first day, Marlowe had repaired the north wall, inventoried his food stores, identified that he was running low on flour and critically low on salt pork, and reorganized the kitchen shelving in a way that made the space approximately twice as functional. She had done all of this quietly and without fanfare, and she had done it alongside raising 2 children in a space that wasn't hers, keeping them fed and occupied and out of Silas's way without making a production of it. That night at supper, she set 4 places at the table without thinking about it, just reached for the extra plates and put them down, and then looked up and caught herself doing it, and looked at Silas to see what he would say. He didn't say anything. He sat down. Storm broke on the 3rd morning. The silence that followed a Wyoming blizzard had a particular quality, dense and absolute, like the world had held its breath and was only now exhaling. Silas stood on the porch and looked at the white landscape and thought about what came next. Hatch, the fabric merchant, had slept in the supply shed and was pathetically grateful and would be leaving as soon as the road was passable. He had spent most of 2 days pretending he wasn't listening to everything, which left Silas and the woman from Missouri and her 2 children. He went back inside. Marlowe was at the table with May, looking at something, a piece of paper with writing on it. May was pointing to a section and explaining something in a low voice. They looked up when he came in. "What is that?" Silas asked. May said without preamble, "Survey marker records. Mama found them in the box under the window bench." Silas went still. He knew what those records were. He'd inherited them from his father along with the land, along with the deed, along with the stack of papers he'd never properly sorted through, because Eleanor used to handle correspondence, and after she died, he'd simply stopped dealing with it. The records were old, some of them, and they showed the exact locations of the original boundary markers for his 340 acres markers that matched up with the creek bend on the eastern edge. He had not thought about those records since the trouble with Gideon Crow started. "Where did you find that box?" he asked. "Under the window bench," Marlowe said. The lid was warped. May noticed it was loose, and she paused. "I'm sorry if we—" "Crow has been claiming 80 acres of my eastern grazing land," Silas said. "Says the original boundary was a 1/4 mile west of where my father staked it. His lawyers sent a letter 2 months ago saying he'd take it to the county surveyor." Marlowe looked at the records in front of her. "These show the original stake positions. If they match the physical markers on the ground. They should. My father was meticulous. Then Crow's claim falls apart." She looked up at him. "You need a lawyer who knows land records. Lawyers cost money. These records could save you 80 acres. That's more than money." Silas sat down across from her and looked at the papers. He had walked this land his whole life. He knew every rise and hollow of it. The idea that a man like Crow, who had bought up 3 other ranches in the county through legal pressuring and creative surveying, could simply claim a 1/4 of his eastern grazing ground made something hot and ugly move through his chest. "You understand land records," he said to Marlowe. "My father had a property dispute when I was a teenager. I spent 2 summers reading everything I could find about survey law because he couldn't afford a lawyer and someone had to." She said it matter-of-factly. "I know enough to see that these records are solid." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Outside, the snow was blindingly white in the morning sun. Cattle had survived the storm. The ranch was intact. He had a woman sitting at his table who had arrived uninvited with 2 children he hadn't agreed to, had lied to him in every letter she'd written, and was now calmly and practically helping him save 80 acres he had not known how to fight for. "The hearing is in 6 weeks," he said. "Then we have 6 weeks to organize these records properly," Marlowe said. May, who had been listening silently, put her finger on a line in the document. "This notation here does that matched the eastern creek bend." Silas looked at the notation. He looked at May. She was 8 years old, and she had found that detail in about 3 minutes. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly the creek bend." May nodded, satisfied. The 6 weeks before the hearing did something to Silas Boone that he wouldn't have predicted and couldn't fully explain, even to himself. He was not a man who adapted easily to change. Eleanor's death had left him in a kind of suspended state. Not grief exactly, not anymore, but a hollowness that had calcified into habit. He got up in the dark. He fed the cattle. He ate alone. He went to sleep in the chair because the bed felt too large and too quiet. He did the same things in the same order, and he did not particularly expect any of it to change. And then a woman arrived in a blizzard with 2 children, and the house changed around him before he fully realized it was happening. It wasn't comfortable, not at first. Marlowe's presence was efficient and quietly determined, and occasionally, he noticed fragile in ways she was working hard not to show. She had arrived running from something, and the weight of that sat on her, even in moments when she seemed perfectly composed. There were mornings she stood at the window with her coffee and went somewhere inside herself for 30 seconds, and then came back and went on with the day. He didn't ask about it. Not yet. May was different from any child he had known. She was serious in a way that came from being had too much responsibility too young, and she had developed a habit of noticing structural problems, loose boards, weak fence rails, gaps in the barn wall, that was genuinely useful and slightly unnerving. She told him about the problems the way an engineer might, without drama, simply, the 3rd board on the east fence is cracked through, it won't hold weight next spring. He found himself checking the boards she mentioned. She was never wrong. And then there was Nell. Nell was impossible to ignore, which was perhaps the point. She had decided, sometime during the 2nd week, that Silas was someone worth talking to, and she pursued this project with the single-minded dedication of a child who had not yet learned that some people preferred silence. She showed him her stones. She showed him every single one of them, explaining what she liked about each: the color, the shape, the weight in her hand. Silas had grown up on this land and knew the local geology better than most, and he found himself, against his will, explaining which stones were limestone and which were quartz, and why some had stripes. Nell listened with enormous seriousness, and then said, "Which one's your favorite?" He picked a gray-white striped piece that was smooth on one side and rough on the other. "This one." Nell looked at it. "You can keep it," she said. He tried to give it back. "No," she said firmly, "it's yours now." I decided. He put it in his coat pocket. He wasn't sure why. The hearing with Gideon Crow took place in the county courthouse on a gray January morning. Crow arrived with 2 lawyers and a surveyor he'd apparently paid to produce a competing boundary assessment. He was the kind of man who believed that preparation was a form of dominance, that if he showed up with more people and more paper, the outcome was already decided. He did not expect Silas to have the original survey records properly organized, cross-referenced with the creek bend measurements, and annotated in a clear hand by a woman who had spent 3 weeks turning a box of old documents into something a judge could actually use. Marlowe sat in the gallery. She had offered to stay at the ranch, and Silas had told her that she should come, that it was her work as much as his, and she had looked at him a moment before nodding. The lawyer Silas had hired a young man named Prescott, who had a good reputation and reasonable rates presented the records. Presented them well, but Silas noticed that the man kept referencing notes that Marlowe had written out for him, specific page numbers, and cross-references she had organized. Crow's surveyor argued that the records were old and potentially inaccurate. Prescott asked when the survey markers had been physically verified last. Crow's surveyor admitted he had not physically verified them. He had worked from Crow's description of the boundary. The judge looked over the original records for a long time. Crow lost. It wasn't a dramatic victory in the room, just a judge's measured ruling, delivered in the flat language of legal decisions, but outside, on the courthouse steps, Silas stopped walking and turned to Marlowe, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. "It was your father's records," she said. "They were already there. You organized them. You found what mattered." She looked away toward the street. A wagon was passing, 2 men arguing about a load of timber, ordinary life going on around them. "I needed to be useful," she said, which was more honest than she'd perhaps intended. He understood that. He understood it in the specific way of a person who has survived loss by making themselves necessary, because necessity is easier to hold on to than grief. "You are," he said. "Useful." She looked back at him. It was an awkward compliment, and they both knew it, and neither of them laughed, which was perhaps the moment something shifted, slightly, without announcement. It was 3 days after the hearing that the letter arrived from Missouri. Silas was in the barn when Marlowe came to find him. He knew immediately from the way she was standing, rigid but contained, the way a person stands when they are holding something indeliberately, that it was bad news. She held out the envelope. He could see it had already been opened. He read it. Elias Whitmore had found her. He did not know how. A postmaster, probably, or someone she had trusted, or simply the relentless patience of a man who had resources and time, and a legal claim he believed in completely. The letter was from a lawyer in Jefferson City, and it was careful and formal, and it said that Marlowe's late husband's brother intended to pursue legal custody of May and Nell on the grounds that their mother was unstable, had abandoned the family home, and had taken the children across state lines without the consent of the family. Silas read the letter twice. He set it down on the fence rail. The wind was cold and steady. Herman, the spotted cow, was watching him from across the pen with the blank bovine patience that Nell had attributed to the animal knowing things. "He'll come himself," Marlowe said. "The letter is just to tell me he's coming. He wants me to know there's nothing I can do. Is there anything he can legally claim? He has money. He has lawyers. He has men in Jefferson City who will say whatever he asks them to say." She was looking at the ground. "He told me after the funeral that a widow with 2 children and no property has no standing. That the law will see it his way because the law was written by men like him." "That's not entirely wrong," Silas said, which was the truth, and she deserved the truth. "I know." She looked up. Her eyes were steady. He realized been expecting this. Probably from the moment she mailed the first letter to the agency. Maybe before. "I thought Wyoming would be far enough." Silas was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about a lot of things at once. About the law, which was imperfect and uneven. About men like Crow and men like Elias Whitmore, who used the machinery of legal process the way other men used fists. About a child who had told him he could keep a striped stone because she'd decided it was his. "There's something that would change your legal standing," he said. Marlowe waited. "If you were married," Silas said carefully, "to a man with property and established standing in this county, it would be considerably harder for Whitmore to argue you were unstable or without a home." The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when 2 people are having one conversation out loud and a different, more complicated one internally. "It's not why you originally wanted a wife," Marlowe said. "No," he agreed. "And this wouldn't be, I know what it wouldn't be," Silas said. "I'm not pretending otherwise." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold light made everything very clear, every line of her face, every trace of what the last year had cost her. "I have 2 daughters," she said, which was both a reminder and a question. "I know," Silas said. "I have a ranch that needs more people than one man who falls asleep in a chair." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't romantic in any conventional sense. But it was honest, which between 2 people who had each survived loss by learning to distrust easy comfort was more valuable than most things. Marlowe looked away, then back. "All right," she said. Outside, the wind moved across the land in long, slow sweeps. Somewhere in the house, Nell was counting her stones again. They married on a Thursday morning in February, in the county clerk's office in Laramie, with a clerk named Dorothea as witness, and Hatch the fabric merchant who had, inexplicably, not yet left the county standing to one side looking emotional about it in a way that embarrassed everyone present. May held Nell's hand. Nell wore her stone pouch tied to her belt. It clinked twice during the brief ceremony, and nobody said anything about it. Silas signed his name. Marlowe signed hers. The clerk stamped the certificate and told them congratulations in the tone of a woman who had stamped several hundred of these and found them neither remarkable nor unimportant. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon. The road was still half frozen, rutted from the thaw and freeze cycle that February in Wyoming specialized in. Nobody said much. May watched the landscape. Nell fell asleep against her sister's shoulder somewhere around the 3rd mile. Silas kept his eyes on the road. It was not the kind of wedding either of them had imagined. At whatever point in their younger lives they had imagined such things. Marlowe had married Thomas Bennett in a church in Jefferson City with her mother crying in the second pew and a reception afterward, where her aunt made a cake that leaned noticeably to the left. That had felt like a beginning. This felt like something different. A decision, a practical arrangement between 2 people who had run out of better options, dressed up in paperwork. She was not unhappy about it. She simply understood clearly what it was and what it wasn't. That night she made supper salt, pork and corn mush, and the last of a jar of preserves she'd found at the back of the pantry shelf. And they ate the 4 of them at the table. And when it was over, Silas washed the dishes, because he had apparently always washed his own dishes and wasn't stopping now, and Marlowe dried them. And they worked around each other in the kitchen in silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. Just 2 people learning the physical geography of coexistence. May put Nell to bed in the small room off the kitchen that had been a storage space until Silas cleared it out the second week they were there, without announcement, just moved the crates and put down a pallet and said flatly that they'd build a proper bed frame when the ground thawed. He hadn't done it yet. May had reminded him twice. Kept meaning to. That was where things stood on the day Elias Whitmore arrived in Wyoming. Came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the wedding. Marlowe was hanging washing on the line when she heard the horse. She didn't know it was him at first. Just heard a horse moving at a deliberate pace up the access road, not the loose trot of a neighbor or the faster clip of the mail rider. A measured pace. A man who had thought about this arrival. Turned. Elias Whitmore had aged since the funeral, or maybe she had simply not looked at him closely enough then to notice the lines around his mouth and the gray at his temples. He had always seemed ageless in the way certain hard men do built for endurance, impervious to softening. He was on a good horse with good tack and a coat that cost more than most men in Laramie earned in a month. He looked at the ranch the way he looked at everything, measuring, calculating, deciding what it was worth and whether he wanted it. His eyes found her at the clothesline. He pulled his horse up 10 yards away and sat for a moment without speaking. Marlowe's hands had gone still on the sheet she was pinning. She made herself finish pinning it before she turned to face him fully. She was not going to let him see her stop what she was doing. "Marlowe," he said. "Elias, you look well." He said it the way people say things they don't mean but want to establish as neutral ground before they move on to what they actually intend. "I am well," she said. "What are you doing here?" "You know why I'm here. I'd like you to say it." He swung down from his horse with the ease of a man who had ridden his whole life. He tied the reins to the fence post, her fence post or Silas's, which was now arguably hers, and took 2 steps toward her, not threatening, just closing the distance enough to establish that he was larger and she should be aware of it. "I've come for the girls," he said. "I told you in the letter what my intentions were. I hoped you'd be sensible about it." "I'm married," Marlowe said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprised, she could see he already knew. His lawyer would have checked the county records before he left Missouri. He had known when he set out. He had come anyway. "A mail-order arrangement to a man you've known 3 months doesn't change the legal picture substantially," he said. "My lawyer believes—" "Your lawyer isn't here," Marlowe said. "You are." The sound of the barn door was what saved her from saying something she'd regret. Silas came out carrying a length of fence rail, because he'd been repairing the south fence line and had heard the horse and come up to the house, without being obvious about it. He set the rail against the barn wall and walked toward them with the unhurried pace of a man who was on his own land and knew it. Elias watched him come. Silas stopped beside Marlowe, not in front of her, beside her, and looked at Elias Whitmore with an expression that gave away nothing specific. "Silas Boone," he said, "Elias Whitmore." The 2 men looked at each other. "You've met my sister-in-law, my wife," Silas said. Just the 2 heat in them. Elias nodded slowly. "So I understand a quick arrangement. Necessary circumstances," Silas said. "Yes. That's an interesting way to describe it." Elias looked around the ranch at the house, the barn, the cattle visible at the far end of the pasture. "I'll be direct, Mr. Boone. I have no quarrel with you. My concern is with my brother's daughters. It was my brother's dying wish that those children be raised within the family." Marlowe chose to interpret that differently than he intended. Marlowe said, "Thomas never said any such thing. He said it to me. Then he had a very different conversation with you than he ever had with me. He told me the girls were mine to raise. He told me that the week before he died. You were alone with him," Elias said. "There are no other witnesses to that." Silas watched this exchange without interrupting. He was learning things about Marlowe, about Whitmore, about what she had been living with, that she hadn't told him in so many words, but which were becoming clear in the gaps between what was being said. "You're welcome to stay the night," Silas said to Elias. Both Marlowe and Elias looked at him. "It's a long ride back to town," Silas said. "We have room. You're family now by marriage. We don't turn family out." Elias studied him. It was a complicated invitation, generous on the surface, and Whitmore was smart enough to know that, and smart enough to know that refusing it would make him look unreasonable before he'd even filed his papers. "That's kind," Elias said carefully. "I'll accept." Marlowe said nothing. She went back to the washing line and pinned 3 more sheets with precise controlled movements while Silas showed Elias where to put the horse. May had been watching from the kitchen window. Marlowe found her there when she came inside, standing to one side of the window so she wouldn't be visible from the yard, watching Silas lead the stranger's horse to the barn. Nell was at the table arranging stones by size. "Is that him?" May asked. "Yes." May looked at her mother's face, doing the rapid assessment she always did, cataloging what she saw. Silas invited him to stay. "Yes." "Why? Because putting him out would give him something to complain about to a judge," Marlowe said. May turned back to the window. He looks like someone who's used to getting what he wants. Marlowe didn't answer that because it was accurate, and there was no comfort she could honestly offer. He's not getting us, May said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered with the particular flat certainty of a child who has decided something and intends to hold to it regardless. No, Marlowe said, he's not. Nell looked up from her stones. Who's not getting us? Nobody, May said, and sat down at the table. Show me the new ones. Supper that evening was the most uncomfortable meal Silas had hosted since the winter he'd had to sit across from a county land agent who had later tried to shortchange him on a water rights assessment. Elias Whitmore was impeccably polite, the kind of polite that's designed to demonstrate how reasonable you are while you're doing something unreasonable. He said please and thank you. He complimented the bread, which was Marlowe's and was genuinely good. He asked Silas considered questions about the cattle operation. Nell stared at him from across the table with the open, unguarded curiosity of a 5-year-old who had not yet been trained to pretend she wasn't staring. Do you have children? Nell asked him. Elias looked at her. Something crossed his face that Silas couldn't interpret. Not warmth, not coldness, something more complicated. No, he said. Why not? Nell, Marlowe said. I'm just asking. It's all right, Elias said. He was looking at Nell with an expression that Silas found, for the first time, genuinely difficult to read. I never married. Silas didn't used to have children either, Nell said, and now he has us. So maybe you could, that's enough, May said, very quietly, and Nell closed her mouth. The table was quiet for a moment. Silas refilled Elias's coffee without being asked. It was the most neutral, deliberate thing he could think to do. After supper, Elias stepped outside. Silas followed him, not because he'd been invited, but because he wanted to. They stood on the porch in the cold. The sky was clear and enormous, the way Wyoming skies got in winter light. The stars were only a field away, not millions of miles. You seem like a practical man, Elias said. I try to be. Then I'll speak practically. Elias looked out at the dark pasture. I'm not a villain in this story. Whatever Marlowe has told you, Thomas was my brother. Those girls are his daughters. My family's name, my family's blood. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm trying to do right by my brother's memory. What does right look like? Silas asked. The girls in a proper home, with family, with resources. My house is large, well-staffed. They would want for nothing. They don't want for anything here. Elias turned his head slightly. They're living in a ranch house in Wyoming, with a man who married their mother 3 weeks ago. Respect, Mr. Boone. That's not stability. That's expediency. Silas thought about that. He considered whether to say what he was thinking, and decided that honesty was the only currency that mattered here. Marlowe walked through a blizzard carrying that little girl, he said. Quarter-mile. In the dark. She walked until she couldn't see the coach behind her. She did that because she was not going to let her child freeze. He paused. That's what she does. Whatever the situation is, she does what needs doing. The girls know that about her. I know it. The only stability they need is her. Elias was quiet. File your papers if you're going to file them, Silas said. But I'll tell you what the court's going to see. It's going to see a married woman with property, with a fixed address, with a husband willing to speak for her. And it's going to see 2 children who are fed and warm and where they want to be. Elias said nothing for a moment. Then you barely know them. I know them well enough, Silas said. It was the first time he had said anything like that out loud. He hadn't intended it to come out quite the way it did, not with that particular weight behind it. But it was true, and he found he couldn't unsay it and didn't want to. Elias went to bed in the supply room where Hatch had once slept. He left before breakfast the next morning, before anyone else was up. He took his horse and rode back toward Laramie without a word. 3 weeks later, the legal papers arrived. Marlowe read them at the kitchen table. Silas stood by the window. May was at school, a one-room schoolhouse 2 miles down the road that the local families maintained, where she had been going for 4 weeks and had already corrected the teacher twice on a point of arithmetic, which the teacher had not taken especially well. Nell was in the yard with her stones. Marlowe set the papers down. He's filed for custody, she said. The basis is that I'm unstable, that I abandoned the family home, that I brought the children across state lines without family consent. She paused. That my current marriage is one of convenience and does not constitute a stable domestic situation. Silas moved to the table and sat down. He picked up the papers and read them himself. He was not a fast reader, but he was a thorough one, and he read every line. Prescott, he said when he finished, he handled your land case well. He handled it because you organized the records well. We'll need him again. Marlowe was looking at the table surface. She had a habit, Silas had noticed, of looking at whatever was in front of her when she was thinking through something hard, not zoning out, just grounding herself in the physical world while her mind worked. There's something I haven't told you, she said. He waited. Thomas and I. She stopped, reorganized. The last year of Thomas's life, he wasn't well. And he wasn't kind when he wasn't well. I loved him when he was good to me, and I managed him when he wasn't. That's the truth of it. Elias knows pieces of that year, and he'll use them. He'll say I wasn't a fit wife, that the home was troubled. Children were living in an unstable situation. She looked up. Some of it he can document. A neighbor's testimony. A doctor's records from a visit Thomas made where he told the doctor I was. He'll find something. Silas let her finish. I'm telling you now because Prescott will need to know, she said. And because you deserve to know what you married into. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Nell could be heard talking to herself or possibly to the stones. In the running monologue she kept up when she was absorbed in something. Did you do anything to harm your children? Silas asked. No, or to harm Thomas. She looked at him steadily. No. Then that's what matters, he said. Whatever a man in bad health told his doctor about his wife, he shook his head. People say things when they're suffering. It doesn't make it true. Marlowe looked at him. She had, he realized, been braced for something else. Some judgment, some pulling back. She had told him a hard thing, and he had simply looked at the facts of it. Prescott needs to know everything, Silas said. Every document, every name, everything Elias might use. Same as the Crow case. You organize what we have and figure out what we're up against. This is different from the Crow case, she said. I know. The Crow case was about land. This is about more than that. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she picked up the papers again. I'll write to Prescott this afternoon. Silas went back to the window. Nell had brought her stones into a line along the porch rail and was examining each one with a small, serious frown. He had told Elias Whitmore that he knew the girls well enough. He had meant it when he said it, and he meant it now. He was not sure when that had become true. It had happened somewhere between Herman, the cow and the north wall repair, and May's quiet, accurate assessment of the cracked fence board. But it was true. What he was less sure of was what exactly that meant for him, what it said about who he was becoming, or who he had already become without quite noticing. He supposed he'd have time to work that out. Prescott came to the ranch on a Thursday morning, riding out from Laramie with a saddlebag full of papers and the slightly windburned look of a man who had made a cold ride to get here. He was young, couldn't have been more than 30, and he had the kind of careful, structured mind that showed up in the way he organized information as fast as it came in, asking questions and scribbling notes simultaneously. He sat at the kitchen table with Marlowe and Silas. May was at school. Nell had been given strict instructions to stay in the yard and had so far followed them, which was unusual enough that Marlowe kept glancing at the window. Walk me through Missouri, Prescott said. Start from when your husband died. Marlowe walked him through it. She was precise and unemotional about it. Not cold, just structured the way she organized everything. She told him about Thomas's death, about Elias's arrival the day after the funeral, about the lawyer in Jefferson City, about why she left and when she left and what she took. She told him about the condition of the house, about the finances, about what she could document and what she couldn't. Prescott wrote without looking up. The doctor's records, he said, when she reached that part. Thomas's records from the last year. You think Whitmore can access those? He has the name of the doctor and the money to hire a lawyer who knows how to subpoena medical records, Marlowe said. Yes, I think he can. What would those records say? She was quiet for a moment. Silas had heard the relevant part already, but hearing her say it again in different words, in the flat, practical language of legal context, was different. Thomas told his doctor that I was difficult, that I made his illness harder, that I think the word he used was unreasonable. She paused. He was in pain for a long time. Pain makes people say things. Did you have your own physician? Anyone who saw you and the children regularly? A doctor in Jefferson City. Hadfield. He treated Nell for an ear infection the year before Thomas died, and he was kind. He asked me once if I was all right, in a way that suggested he could see I wasn't. I don't know if he documented anything. Prescott made a note. Worth writing to gently, he looked up. Witnesses to your character, neighbors, friends, anyone in Missouri who could speak to your care of the children. I had one neighbor, Ada Gresham, who knew our situation well. But she's elderly, and she wouldn't travel to Wyoming. A written affidavit can be submitted if she's willing to sign one. Marlowe nodded. She might be. Prescott turned to Silas. And you. He's going to argue that this marriage is expediency. You need to be able to speak to what this household actually is. He said it not as a question, but as a statement of what was coming. I know what this household is, Silas said. You need to be able to tell a judge what these children mean to you, in specific terms, not general statement specifics. What you see, what you've observed, what you know about them. Silas thought about this. He thought about Nell's stone pouch and the way she slept, with one hand under her cheek and the stone pouch tucked against her chest. He thought about May, noticing the cracked fence board, and reporting it the way an engineer would, without drama. He thought about the morning 2 weeks ago, when May had come to the barn before school, ostensibly to tell him about a split rail, but had actually stood there in the cold for 10 minutes asking him questions about the cattle, and their feed genuinely curious, he realized, genuinely interested in how the ranch worked. I can do that, he said. Prescott looked between them. He was young, but he wasn't naive, and Silas suspected he had read the situation in the first 10 minutes of the conversation. One more thing, Prescott said. He looked at Marlowe. Is there anything Whitmore doesn't know? Anything that might come out in testimony that he doesn't currently have access to, and that might damage your case if it surfaces unexpectedly? Kitchen was quiet. The fire ticked. There's nothing, Marlowe said, that I haven't already told you or told Silas. It was the first time she had put them in the same category like that. Things she'd told Prescott. Things she'd told Silas if they occupied equivalent spaces. As if Silas was someone she reported to, was accountable to, in the way you're accountable to someone whose opinion you've decided matters. Prescott folded his papers and stood. The hearing will likely be set for spring. We have time to prepare. I want affidavits, witnesses if possible, and a clear account of your daily life here meals, routines, the children's schooling. A judge wants to see stability. We show stability. After he left, Marlowe stood at the window watching him ride back toward the road. Silas was still at the table. He's good, she said. He was good on the land case. This one's harder. She turned from the window. If Elias has money and Missouri connections, Prescott knows Wyoming law better than any lawyer Elias hires from Missouri, Silas said. That matters. Marlowe looked at him. There was something in her expression that was different. The careful, contained look she usually wore. Something slightly less guarded. Are you afraid we'll lose? He considered that honestly. I think we could lose if we're not careful. I don't think we're going to be careless. She nodded. She went to the stove and started on the noon meal because it was almost noon, and there was a child outside who would be hungry. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm, different from the winter weeks before. The land case had been a shared problem that bonded them the way practical difficulty often bonds. People through the work of solving it, the clean satisfaction of documentation and evidence, and a judge's ruling. This was different. This problem lived inside the house, inside the family, inside the specific geography of what they were to each other. Silas noticed changes in the girls that he couldn't quite account for. Nell was, if anything, more affectionate than usual. She had started sitting beside him in the evenings when he read, not talking, just there, leaning slightly in his direction, the way a plant leans toward light. He wasn't sure if she understood what was at stake or if she was responding to the tension in the house on some instinctive level that adults had trained themselves out of. May was harder to read. May was always harder to read, quieter than usual, doing her schoolwork with more than her normal focus, coming home with perfect papers and setting them on the table without comment. She had started, without being asked, keeping the woodbox full, not just adding a log when it was low, but actually carrying a full day's worth in every morning before school, which meant getting up earlier and working in the cold and not saying a word about it. Silas watched her do this one morning from the barn door and felt something that he identified, after a moment, as a kind of admiration. Plain and uncomplicated. The girl was 8 years old and she was doing the only thing she knew how to do in the face of an uncertain situation, which was to be useful and competent and not a burden. He had done the same thing at her age, more or less. After his father's bad seasons when there wasn't enough, and the house was tight with worry. You just found something that needed doing, and you did it. He crossed the yard. I can carry in the rest, he said. May looked up. I have it, I know you have it, he said. I'm offering. A pause. She looked at the remaining wood, then at him, then gave him a small, pragmatic nod and handed over half the stack. They carried it in together without conversation. He held the door. She stacked the wood. They moved around each other in the kitchen without collision. That was all. But Silas thought about it for the rest of the morning. Spring came slowly, the way it always did in Wyoming, grudgingly, in fits, with patches of warmth that got snatched back by a late cold snap before the land finally decided to commit. The mud season was brutal. The access road became nearly impassable for 2 weeks, and Silas spent those weeks working on the interior of the ranch, patching the bed frame he had promised May in December, and finally delivered in March, reinforcing the barn wall on the south side, working through the list of things he had let slide during the long years of living alone. Marlowe worked alongside him on most of it. Not all of it. She had the house, the cooking, the garden preparations, the correspondence with Prescott and with Ada Gresham in Missouri, who had agreed, after 3 careful letters, to provide a written affidavit. But when there was something to be done on the structure of the place, she showed up with her sleeves rolled and her opinions ready, and they had at least 2 arguments about the best way to reinforce a doorframe that both of them later privately decided they had won. It was a strange way to build a marriage, but it was the way they built it. One evening in late March, with the mud drying to something firmer and the first shoots of green visible at the edge of the south pasture, Silas came into the kitchen to find Marlowe at the table with a piece of paper in front of her. Not Prescott's papers, not the affidavit materials. Something else her handwriting, but stopped mid-sentence. "What's that?" he asked. She looked up. "I was trying to write out what I'd say. At the hearing, if I have to speak, Prescott will help you with that." "I know." She looked at the paper. I wanted to know what I actually want to say, before someone else shapes it." A pause. "Tell them why I left. The real reason. Not just the legal reason." He sat down. "The legal reason is the custody threat," she said. "That's true, and Prescott will use it. But the real reason." She stopped, looked at the window. "Thomas was sick for a long time before he died. And when he was sick, he was frightened. And when he was frightened, he was cruel. Not with his hands, but with his words, with his moods. And the girls saw it. They saw their mother manage a frightened man, and they saw what that cost. May stopped sleeping well for 2 years. Nell used to hide her stones because she thought Thomas might throw them. She said this last part quietly. He never did, but she thought he might." Silas said nothing. "When he died, I grieved him," Marlowe said. "I want you to know that. He was a good man before he was a sick man, and I loved the good man. But I also felt," she shook her head, "I felt the house get quiet in a way it hadn't been for 2 years. And I thought, now I can go somewhere, and my daughters don't have to watch me manage something I can barely manage." "And then Elias showed up," Silas said. "And then Elias showed up." She looked back at the paper. "I want to tell the court that I left, because my daughters needed quiet and safety, and a mother who wasn't exhausted all the time. That I came here looking for something steady. That I found—" She stopped. He waited. "That I found more than I expected," she finished. The fire was low. Outside, the night was full of the small sounds of early spring something, moving in the pasture, the creak of the barn in the wind. Silas looked at the half-finished letter on the table and thought about what she had just said, about what she had survived, about what had been sitting behind those careful, competent eyes all winter. Not just the fear of Elias, but the longer exhaustion underneath it. He thought about Eleanor, about the particular silence of a house after loss. Thought about the way things sometimes became real, not when you decided them, but when you found yourself already living them. "Write," he said. "Everything you just told me. Write it the way you said it." Marlowe looked at him. "True," he said. "True testimony is the hardest kind to argue against." Picked up her pen. He got up and put another log on the fire and left her to write. Prescott had told them to expect a spring hearing. What he hadn't told them, because he couldn't have known, was how much ground could shift in the weeks between filing and courtroom, and how little of that shifting would happen in places they could see. The first sign came from Ada Gresham. Marlowe had written to her 4 times since January. Careful letters, warm but practical, laying out what she needed and why. Ada had responded to each one promptly in the shaky but legible handwriting of a woman in her late 70s who had lived next door to the Bennett house for 11 years and had seen enough of what went on inside it to form an honest opinion. She had agreed to the affidavit. She had signed the paper Prescott sent and returned it by post. Then, in the first week of April, she wrote again. The letter was shorter than usual. "I must tell you that Elias Whitmore's man came to see me last Tuesday. A lawyer from Jefferson City. He was polite, but his questions were not polite questions. He asked about Thomas's last year, and about the condition of the house, and about whether I had ever seen you behave in ways that concerned me with respect to the children. I told him the truth, which is that you were a devoted mother in very hard circumstances." He wrote it all down. He also told me before he left that providing testimony in a custody proceeding could be complicated for a person of my age and situation. I am not sure exactly what he meant by that, but I am sure I did not like the sound of it. I want you to know that I have not changed my mind. I signed the paper, and I mean what I signed. But I thought you should know he was here. Marlowe read the letter at the table and then folded it very carefully and set it on the pile of Prescott's papers. He's been to Missouri, she told Silas that evening. Silas looked up from where he was sharpening a blade at the other end of the table. He set the whetstone down. Whitmore's lawyer visited Ada. Tried to rattle her. She paused. I think he succeeded, at least partly. Did she change the affidavit? No, but she's frightened. Marlowe looked at the folded letter. She's an old woman living alone, and a lawyer from Jefferson City told her that testifying could be complicated. That's a threat dressed up as a concern, and she knows it, and she signed anyway, which means she's braver than she's comfortable being. That's the kind of bravery that tends to hold, Silas said. Marlowe wasn't so sure. She had seen people be brave up to a point, and then reach the edge of what they could manage and stop. She didn't blame Ada. She couldn't afford to count on her. She wrote to Prescott the next morning. Prescott wrote out 3 days later, earlier than planned, and sat at the table with the letter in front of him, and the expression of a man who had suspected something like this, and was now confirming the suspicion. Whitmore's thorough, he said. He has money and time, Marlowe said. That combination makes men thorough. He's also building a secondary argument. Prescott set the letter down. He's not just going to argue that you're unstable. He's going to argue that you deliberately isolated the children from family, that leaving Missouri was an act of alienation, not protection. That framing is more sympathetic. A judge hears unstable mother and thinks one thing. A judge hears children cut off from their father's family and thinks another. Silas said, "What's the counter to that framing?" The counter is what the children's life actually looks like. Not in the abstract, not they're well cared for as a general statement. Specific, concrete. What does a week here look like? Who are they becoming? What have they gained? He looked at Silas. You're the center of that argument. You're the reason this isn't just widow with children versus established family. You're what changes the picture. I'll say what's true, Silas said. I know. I need you to understand how true it needs to sound. Not perform true. A judge can hear the difference. Prescott paused. There's something else. I wrote to the county records office in Jefferson City, asking about any prior legal actions involving the Whitmore family and the Bennett estate. I got a response yesterday. He opened his bag and produced another paper. Thomas Bennett died without a formal will. His estate, what there was of it, would have passed to Marlowe under Missouri inheritance law. But there was a lien held by Elias Whitmore against the house. A loan he made to Thomas 3 years before Thomas died. Marlowe went very still. I didn't know about a loan, she said. Thomas may not have told you, or Elias may have formalized it after the fact. The documentation is dated 2 years before Thomas died, but the recording with the county was done 4 months after his death. Prescott looked at her carefully. That lien effectively absorbed most of the estate's value. It also means Elias had financial standing in the Bennett household that predates the custody question. His lawyers may use it to argue that his involvement in the family's affairs is long-standing and appropriate. Kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of May's voice in the other room, reading aloud to Nell from the book with the falling-off cover. The ordinary sound of it, the patient repetition of a child reading to a younger child, sat strangely against the weight of what Prescott had just laid on the table. He manufactured the lien, Marlowe said. Her voice was even. Or he manipulated Thomas into signing something. Thomas didn't understand. Thomas wasn't. In the last 2 years, he wasn't always clear about what he was agreeing to. Can you demonstrate that? I can tell you it's true. I can demonstrate it. She shook her head. Thomas's Dr. Hadfield. He documented Thomas's condition. The deterioration was significant enough. There could be grounds to question the validity of documents Thomas signed in that period. Prescott made a note. Dr. Hadfield. I'll write to him. He was kind, Marlowe said again. He saw what was happening. I just don't know if he wrote any of it down. After Prescott left, Marlowe stayed at the table for a long time. Silas went out to the barn, worked through the afternoon feeding, came back at dusk, and found her in the same chair. Not motionless, she was working, going through papers, writing notes, but she had the look of someone who had been sitting in one place long enough for the sitting to mean something. He manufactured a loan, she said when Silas sat down across from her. Maybe, not maybe. Thomas would have told me. He told me everything financial because I handled the accounts. He would have told me about a loan from his brother. She set her pen down. Elias gave Thomas money, and then after Thomas died, he turned it into a legal instrument. And he did it because he knew he was going to need standing. He was planning this before Thomas was in the ground. Silas thought about that, about the kind of patience required to plan that carefully, to make a quiet arrangement with a sixth man, to wait, to formalize it after the death, to build a case over months and years. It was a cold, methodical way to operate. People like Whitmore count on the other side, not knowing how they work, Silas said. Now you know. Knowing doesn't undo the document. No, but Prescott will find Hadfield, and Hadfield will say what he saw. And we keep building what we have. He looked at her. One thing at a time, she looked back at him. The lamplight was low, and the evening was settling around the house, and she looked, Silas thought, like a person who was carrying something she had been carrying for a long time, and was finally aware of the weight. You're very calm about this, she said. I'm not calm, he said. I'm steady. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. Thomas used to get loud when things were hard. I always thought I preferred quiet, but I didn't know quiet could be... She stopped. Could be what? She shook her head. Never mind, I'm tired. Then sleep, he said. She didn't argue this time. She gathered her papers and went to bed, and Silas sat alone at the table with the lamp burning low and thought about what she'd started to say and what she'd decided not to finish. May came home from school the following Friday with a bruised lip and a story she was reluctant to tell. Marlowe found the bruise when May came through the door, not immediately because May had her coat collar up and her chin down, but by the time she set her school bag on the bench and turned toward the kitchen, the angle of the light caught it, and Marlowe said, "What happened to your face?" It wasn't a question. May knew better than to try to redirect her mother's attention when she used that tone. Morton Gressley, May said. Who's Morton Gressley? He's 14. He's in the older group. May sat down and began unlacing her boots with an air of wanting this conversation to end. He said something about us. About how we came here, he said. His father said Silas paid for us like cattle. Kitchen went quiet. Nell, who was at the table with her stones, had gone still. Marlowe kept her voice level with visible effort. What did you say to him? Told him he was wrong, and then? May looked at her boots. And then he said it again, and I pushed him, and he pushed me back, and my face hit the desk. Marlowe crossed the room and tilted May's chin up with 2 fingers to look at the bruise. It was a good one lip swollen, a cut at the corner of her mouth that had already closed over. Did you get in trouble with the teacher? Mrs. Aberfoyle said we both had to stay after and sweep the floor. May paused. Morton did a bad job sweeping. Was it worth it? Marlowe asked. May looked at her mother directly. Yes, Marlowe let go of her chin. She went to the stove and put the kettle on, because she needed something to do with her hands for 30 seconds. When Silas came in from the barn an hour later, he read the room Marlowe's set expression, Nell's unusual quietness, May's bruised lip, and asked no questions until supper was on the table and the meal was half finished. Then he said to May, "What happened to your face?" May told him. Same story, same words, without embellishment. She had the habit of reporting things accurately, without adjusting the account for her audience. Silas listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "What did you push him with? Hands or shoulder?" May blinked. She had expected a different response. Hands. Shoulders better. You've got more weight behind it, and it's harder for the other person to grab. He resumed eating. Also, if someone says something like that again, and you want to correct the record, you don't have to push first. You can just say, plainly, my stepfather is a man who pulled me out of a blizzard when he didn't have to. That tends to land harder than a push. May stared at him. Nell said, "Did you really pull us out of a blizzard?" "I pulled May out of the blizzard," Silas said. "Your mother pulled you." Nell considered this. "That's true," she said, and went back to her corn. Marlowe hadn't said anything through any of this. She was looking at her plate, and when Silas glanced at her, he saw that her jaw was set in the particular way it got when she was holding something in that she didn't want to let out at the table. Later, after the girls were in bed, she was at the window again. She had a habit of standing at windows in the evening. He'd noticed it all winter, this particular stillness she arrived at when the day was done and the house was quiet. "You told May what to say," Marlowe said. "Not an accusation. An observation," I told her. "What's true, you said she was your stepdaughter." He looked at her. "She is my stepdaughter. That's what the marriage certificate says." "That's not," she stopped. "Start it again. You didn't say it like it was on a certificate. You said it like it was." She shook her head and looked back at the window. He waited. "You're not doing this for the hearing," she said. "Are you?" It wasn't a question exactly. It had the shape of someone discovering something they'd been circling around for weeks and finally deciding to look at it directly. "No," he said. "I'm not doing it for the hearing." The window was dark with the spring night. Somewhere in the pasture a calf was calling, one of the new ones, born 2 weeks ago, still not comfortable with the dark. Marlowe listened to it for a moment. "I should tell you something," she said. "All right, when I wrote those letters, when I left May and Nell out of them, I told myself I was being practical, that I would explain in person and he'd understand. But that's not the whole truth." She turned from the window. "The whole truth is that I was afraid if I told the truth you'd say no. And I needed someone to say yes. She stopped, crossed her arms over her chest, which was a thing she did when she was saying something that cost her. "I needed somewhere to go. And I was afraid the truth would close the door." "It might have," Silas said. "I know. I don't know what I would have done. If I'd gotten a letter from a widow with 2 daughters looking for a ranch husband in Wyoming, I'd like to think I'd have been open to it, but I was—" He paused. "I was living in a very small circle. I'm not sure I would have read it right. So I was right to lie. I didn't say that," she almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile, just the suggestion of one at the corner of her mouth. "That's a very careful answer." "I'm a careful man." She looked at him for a moment longer in the way she had of looking at things when she was making a decision. Then she said, "I'm glad the letter reached you and not someone else." He held her gaze. "So am I." Dr. Hadfield's response arrived on a Tuesday in mid-April, 12 days after Prescott wrote to him. The letter was 2 pages, written in the compact, precise hand of a man trained to document things accurately. Prescott wrote out the same afternoon he received it and read the key passages aloud at the kitchen table. Thomas Bennett had been under Dr. Hadfield's care for 14 months before his death. In the final 6 months, his cognitive clarity had deteriorated significantly. Hadfield's word, significantly, underlined once. He had documented 2 separate appointments at which Thomas had appeared confused about financial matters, including one occasion where Thomas had referred to a debt he believed he owed to a business partner in St. Louis, which Hadfield had noted was inconsistent with what Thomas had described of his circumstances in prior visits. Hadfield had not at the time considered this noteworthy enough to investigate further, but in retrospect, and in light of Prescott's inquiry, he was willing to state, in a signed declaration, that Thomas Bennett's capacity to enter into binding financial agreements in the final year of his life was, in his medical opinion, seriously compromised. Marlowe sat very still while Prescott read. "He'll testify?" Silas asked. "He said he's willing to provide a written declaration. Traveling to Wyoming is harder. He's elderly, has a practice to maintain. But a declaration from an attending physician questioning the deceased's capacity is significant. Directly challenges the legitimacy of the lien." Prescott set the letter down. "It won't erase the document, but it puts it in question. A judge considering that lien alongside a medical declaration about Thomas's cognitive state has to weigh them against each other." "Elias's lawyers will attack Hadfield's declaration," Marlowe said. "They'll try. But he's Thomas's own doctor, established record. No apparent motive to favor your side." Prescott folded the letter. "This is good news, Mrs. Boone." She had been Mrs. Boone for 2 months, and still occasionally registered the name with a slight pause, the way a person adjusts to a 2-piece of clothing. Not uncomfortable, just aware of it. "What does the hearing look like now?" she asked. "Better than it did 3 weeks ago. The lien is compromised. The affidavit from Ada Gresham stands. Hadfield's declaration addresses Thomas's capacity. And you have—" Prescott gestured at the room in a way that encompassed the house, the ranch, the life that had built itself over the winter. "You have this, which is in the end the strongest argument." "The judge hasn't seen this," Silas said. "He'll only see what we bring into the courtroom. Which is why I need everything we discussed. Written accounts. Routines. What the children say, what they do, how they spend their days. The more specific, the better." He looked at Silas. "And I want you to think carefully about what you're going to say when you take the stand. Not practice a speech. Just think. Know what you want the judge to understand." After Prescott left, they sat in the quiet that followed the departure of difficult news delivered hopefully. Marlowe was looking at the table again. "Hadfield remembered," she said. "I thought he might not. I thought it might have just been a kind word, a doctor being decent in the moment. But he remembered." "Some people pay attention," Silas said. She nodded slowly. She looked up. "When Prescott says, think about what you want the judge to understand, what are you going to say?" He hadn't fully worked it out yet. He was still in the thinking stage she and Prescott had just told him to enter. There were pieces of it that had been sitting in him for weeks, clear and specific. I'm going to tell the truth, he said. That's not specific enough. Thought for a moment. I'm going to say that I never expected children, that I was not prepared for it and I wasn't gracious about it at first. He paused. And then I'm going to say what happened anyway. What happened anyway? She repeated. Child showed me her stones and told me I could keep one because she'd decided it was mine. He met her eyes. That happened, I'll say that. Marlowe was quiet. And I'll say that another child came to the barn every morning before school asking about the cattle. Not because anyone told her to, just because she wanted to understand how things worked. He shook his head. A judge who hears that and still rules for Whitmore is a judge who's made up his mind before he walked in, and there's nothing we can do about that. But I don't think that's the judge we're getting. She looked at him for a long moment. You've thought about this more than you let on, she said. I think about most things more than I let on, he said. Character failing. That surprised a real laugh out of her short, unguarded, the kind of laugh that came out before you decided to let it. She pressed her hand briefly over her mouth, then dropped it, and she was still almost smiling when Nell came through the door trailing her coat on the floor and asking what was for supper. 3 days before the hearing, May came to Silas in the barn. He was working on the saddle rig. It had developed a creak that was going to become a problem, and he was addressing it before it did. May stood in the barn doorway for a moment, watching him work, and then came in and sat on the hay bale that Nell typically claimed. Silas didn't stop working, but he glanced up. Something on your mind? May was direct as a rule. She had her mother's dislike of circling around things. But she was quiet for a moment in a way that was unusual for her. At the hearing, she said, Will I have to talk? Prescott says the judge may ask to speak with you privately, or he may not. Depends on the judge. What would he ask? What you want, where you want to live, what your life is like here. May was quiet again. She pulled a piece of straw from the bale and looked at it. I've been writing something, she said. I started it when the legal papers arrived. I didn't tell Mama because I didn't want her to. She stopped. To worry, Silas said. To help me fix it. She said it without apology. It's mine. I wanted it to be in my words. He set down the saddle rig. What is it? A letter. To the judge. She looked up at him. Is that something I'm allowed to do? I don't know. Prescott would know. He looked at her. What did you write? She looked back at the straw in her hand. I wrote about the man who wants to take us and the man who fixed the window. She paused. Uncle Elias's house, I've been to it once when I was small. It was large, lots of rooms. He has 2 housemaids and a cook. There's nothing wrong with it. She folded the straw carefully. But I know what Uncle Elias wants, and it's not me and Nell. Something about his brother, and something about being right. We're just the way he proves he's right. She looked up again. I know the difference between a man who wants to win and a man who gets up before dark to make sure the cattle are warm. Silas said nothing for a moment. I can't tell you whether the judge will read it, he said finally. That's Prescott's call. But write it. Write it in your words, and don't let anyone fix the words. May nodded. She stood up. She was about to go, and then she stopped in the barn doorway and said, without turning around, I told Nell you were going to make sure we stayed. May, I know you can't promise. She turned just enough to look at him over her shoulder. But I needed her to stop being scared at night, and I believe it. So I told her. She paused. I thought you should know. She went back to the house. I sat in the barn for a while after she left. The saddle rig was still on the workbench with the creak unaddressed. Outside, the spring afternoon was going toward evening, the light going amber and long across the pasture. A girl had told her little sister not to be scared because she believed a man she had known since November was going to make sure they were all right. Picked up the saddle rig and went back to work. The night before the hearing, nobody slept especially well. Silas knew this because he was awake at 2 in the morning and could hear through the wall the small sounds of the household being restless. Nell's breathing was audible when it changed. He had learned to hear the difference between her sleeping sounds and her awake sound, and she changed at around midnight and didn't change back. May was quieter, but at some point there was the soft sound of the book with the falling off cover being opened. At some point past 3, Marlowe came out to the kitchen. Silas heard her moving around, the soft sounds of the stove being checked, water being poured. He got up. She was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of water. She turned when he came in and didn't look surprised to see him. Can't sleep either, she said. No, he sat at the table. Stayed at the window. The night outside was clear, one of the first truly clear, warm nights of spring, the stars more distant than they'd been in winter. the air through the window frame carrying something that smelled like mud and new grass. "Tell me something about Eleanor," Marlowe said. He hadn't expected that. He looked at her. She was still looking at the window. "Why?" he asked. "Because I know almost nothing about her, and she was here for years before I was, and this was her house, and she stopped. I'm aware of her sometimes. Not in a strange way. Just in the way you notice someone was somewhere before you. Thought about what to say, about Eleanor, about what was true and simple, and not painful in the way that some truths were. Kept everything," he said. "Every letter, every receipt, every piece of paper that came into this house. That box under the window bench, the one May found with the survey records. That was Eleanor's box. She put those records there 20 years ago." He paused. "She was the one who made sure everything was documented. I never thought to look there after she died, because I couldn't look at anything of hers for a long time." Marlowe turned from the window. She was looking at him, with the particular attention she gave, things she was trying to understand. "The survey records that saved your land," she said slowly. "Eleanor kept those." "Yes." "And it was May who found the box." "Yes." She was quiet. "I don't know what to do with that," she said. "Probably nothing," Silas said. "Some things are just the way they are." She set her water cup down and sat across from him. The lamp was very low. The house was quiet around them in the particular way it got in the deep middle of the night when everyone else was still, and the world reduced to the circle of what you could see and hear from where you were sitting. "I'm afraid tomorrow," she said. "I know, not about the testimony. About after, whatever the judge decides." She folded her hands on the table. "If he rules for Elias, I don't know what I do. I've spent so long running from one thing to the next that I don't know what I do when there's nowhere else to run." Silas looked at her hands on the table. Capable hands calloused across the palms, nicks and small scars from months of ranch work, the right index finger ink-stained from all the letters and notes, and organized records she'd produced in the service of keeping this family together. "If he rules for Elias," Silas said, "we appeal. Prescott has already looked at the grounds." He paused. "And if the appeal fails, we find another way. There is always another way when two people are both looking for it." She looked at him. "You're doing it again." "What?" "Being steady." But this time she said it differently than she had before. Not as an observation, as something closer to gratitude. He didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure one was needed. They sat at the table together until the sky outside began to change, going from black to the deep blue that preceded dawn, and then Marlowe went to wake the girls, and Silas went to feed the cattle. And the last night before the hearing ended the way most important nights end quietly, without ceremony, giving way to the morning that would decide everything. The courthouse in Laramie was a 2-story building that smelled of old wood and lamp oil and the particular staleness of rooms where difficult things were decided regularly. Silas had been inside it twice before once for the land deed transfer when he bought the eastern 40 acres from a neighbor's estate, and once for the Crow hearing. Both times he had known what he was walking into. Both times the problem had been about land, about boundaries, about documents and survey markers and things you could measure. This was not that kind of problem. Marlowe sat beside him on the bench outside the courtroom, while Prescott went in to confirm the hearing schedule with the clerk. She had her hands in her lap, and she was looking at the far wall with the focused, unseeing look of someone running through things internally. She had worn her best-dressed dark blue wool, the collar pressed, and her hair was pinned carefully. She looked like a woman who had taken the mornings seriously. She also looked like a woman who had not slept more than 3 hours. May was beside her, straight backed, in the brown dress she saved for school examinations. She had her letter in her coat pocket. Prescott had read it the previous afternoon and gone quiet for a moment before saying that he would like to submit it as a written statement from the child and that the judge would decide whether to consider it. May had handed it over without asking what would happen to it. She had written it. The rest was out of her hands. Nell was not in the courthouse. She was at the Aberfoyle farm 2 miles from town where Mrs. Aberfoyle, the same teacher who had made May sweep floors after the Morton Gressley incident, had offered to watch her for the day. Silas had been uncertain about leaving her and had said so, and Marlowe had said that bringing a 5-year-old to a custody hearing served no one, which was true, and he had let it go. Elias arrived at 8:30 with 2 men Silas hadn't seen before, both in city clothes, both carrying document cases. The lawyers from Jefferson City. They were efficient-looking men in their 40s, the kind who moved through courthouses the way sailors moved through ports, like they'd done it enough times that nothing about it surprised them anymore. Elias himself looked the same as he had on the ranch porch in February. Composed, unhurried. He acknowledged Silas with a slight nod and looked at Marlowe with the expression of a man who was confident in his position but not unkind about it, which Silas had come to understand was possibly the most dangerous version of Elias Whitmore, the version that believed it was doing right. He did not look at May. May looked at him, though. She looked at him with the same gray-eyed directness she had turned on Silas that first night in the blizzard. The 3-second assessment, the decision made. Then she looked away. Courtroom was smaller than Silas had expected, and the judge was older. A man named Calver, who had been on the Wyoming bench for 16 years and had the deeply unimpressed expression of someone who had heard most of what could be said in a courtroom and found the majority of it insufficiently interesting. He was not unkind. He was simply not going to be worked. Prescott had told them this. Calver doesn't respond to appeals, he'd said. He responds to evidence. Don't try to move him. Just be accurate. Elias's lead lawyer, a man named Aldridge, opened first. He was skilled. Silas granted him that. He laid out the case calmly and in order without drama, which made it land harder than drama would have. He talked about the Bennett family of Jefferson City. He talked about Thomas Bennett's death and the grief his brother Elias had experienced. He talked about the children, their names, their ages, the relationship they had with their paternal uncle. He described Marlowe's departure from Missouri as sudden and unilateral, conducted without the knowledge or consent of the children's surviving paternal family. He described the current domestic arrangement in Wyoming as improvised. He used that word twice, improvised. He said that Mr. Boone was an otherwise respectable rancher, but that his connection to the children was recent, untested, and based on a marriage entered into under practical duress rather than genuine commitment. He did not say that Silas had paid for Marlowe like cattle. He was too practiced for that. But he arranged his words so that the shape of that thought was present in the room without anyone having to say it. Prescott's opening was shorter. He described Marlowe's situation in Missouri, the financial instability, the deteriorating circumstances following Thomas's death, the threat represented by the lien that Dr. Hadfield's declaration called into question. He described her arrival in Wyoming and what had been built since. He did not oversell it. He said, "The evidence will show a woman who made a difficult decision in difficult circumstances and who has since created a stable, rooted life for herself and her daughters." Judge Calver listened to both of them with equal expressionlessness and then called Marlowe to the stand. She walked to the stand the way she walked everywhere, without performance, without pretense. She sat down and looked at the judge and then at Prescott, who gave her the slight nod they had agreed would mean begin when you're ready. She was ready. Prescott took her through it in the order they had prepared. Thomas's death, the weeks afterward. Elias's visit the morning after the funeral. She described it, precisely in her own words, without embellishment. He said, "Those girls are coming with me." He said I could fight it or make it easy. She described her reasoning for leaving. She was direct about the things that made her look imperfect. The decision to omit the children from her letters to Silas, which she named as a deception even though Prescott had suggested softer language. "I left them out because I knew it would change his answer," she said, "and I needed him to say yes. That was the reason. I'm not going to dress it up as something else." Judge Calver made a note. She described the journey, the blizzard, the coach going down, the driver dying, Nell losing warmth too fast. She described the walk through the storm without theatrics. She said I carried her because there was no other option, and I didn't stop, because stopping wasn't available to me. Then Aldridge crossed. He was measured but methodical, and his method was accumulation small concessions, extracted one at a time that added up to a larger picture. He got Marlowe to confirm she had indeed omitted the children from multiple letters. He got her to confirm she had left Jefferson City without informing any member of Thomas's family. He got her to confirm that at the time of the marriage, she and Silas had known each other for approximately 8 weeks. 8 weeks, Aldridge said, as if confirming the arrival of a train. "And you entered into marriage in that time?" "Yes," Marlowe said. "Would you describe that as a considered decision?" "I would describe it as a necessary one." "Necessary for what purpose?" Marlowe looked at him. "Necessary to protect my daughters from a man who had already decided what he wanted and had the money to use the law to get it." Pause. "So the marriage was a legal strategy," Aldridge said. "The marriage was a decision I made with a man I had come to trust, in circumstances that made it urgent. The legal protection was part of the reason. It wasn't the whole reason." She paused. If you're asking me whether I manufactured a marriage solely to frustrate your client's claim, the answer is no. If you're asking whether the timing was influenced by his claim, the answer is yes. Aldridge had wanted her to say yes, it was a legal strategy, and she had given him something more complicated and less usable. He moved on. He raised Thomas's final year. He was careful about it. He had clearly been briefed that Hadfield's declaration existed and that attacking Marlowe directly on this ground was risky. He asked about the state of the marriage. He asked about Thomas's temperament. He asked, with studied neutrality, whether there had been periods of difficulty. Yes, Marlowe said. Thomas was ill for a long time before he died. Illness changed him. It made him frightened. And sometimes that fear came out as cruelty. Not physical, but the other kind. She looked at the judge rather than Aldridge. My daughters saw that. They saw me manage a frightened man for 2 years. I left because I wanted them to have a different kind of life. One where their mother wasn't always braced for the next hard thing. Aldridge let that sit a moment. Then you've described Mr. Bennett as cruel. That's a significant characterization of a man who cannot speak for himself. I know he can't speak for himself, Marlowe said. I was careful about what I said. I said he became frightened, and that fear came out as cruelty. That's the most accurate description I have. I'm not trying to damage his memory. I'm trying to explain why I made the decisions I made. Aldridge stepped back. He had not gotten what he came for. He had gotten something close to it, but not the thing itself, and the difference mattered. Silas was called after the midday recess. He had sat through Marlowe's testimony without moving much, just watching, listening, tracking what landed and what didn't. She had done well. She had been exactly what Prescott had told her to be, accurate. Uncomfortable accuracy was harder to dismiss than polished performance, and she had delivered it without flinching. He took the stand and gave his name and the relevant facts. How long he had owned the ranch, what it comprised, what his life had been before November. Prescott asked him to describe the circumstances of Marlowe and the girl's arrival. He described them plainly. The knock at the door in the blizzard. The child who was losing warmth. The instinct to step back and let them in. There wasn't time to think about it, he said. I just did what needed doing. Prescott asked about the days that followed. He talked about the north wall repair. He talked about Marlowe organizing the food stores, identifying the problems he'd been living around, long time he'd stopped seeing them. He talked about May finding the survey records that saved the eastern 40 acres from Gideon Crow. This was the box of records your late wife had maintained? Prescott asked. Yes. Eleanor kept everything. I hadn't opened that box since she died. May found it because she noticed the lid was warped and loose, and she was curious about why. An 8-year-old noticed something you had missed. Yes, Silas said, without defensiveness, she did. Prescott asked about Nell. Silas talked about the stones. He described the first evening, Nell showing him the pouch and explaining each one. He said, she told me I could keep the gray-white striped one because she'd decided it was mine. I tried to give it back and she said no, it was decided. He paused. I still have it. It's in my coat pocket right now. Judge Calver looked up from his papers, just briefly, then looked back down. Prescott asked about the overall character of the household they had built. It's not a quiet house anymore, Silas said. I'd been living alone for a long time and the house had gotten very quiet. That's quiet like that has a weight to it. These 3 came in and the weight lifted, which wasn't what I was prepared for. He stopped. Still not an easy house. We're still figuring out how to be around each other. We argue about small things. May has opinions about the fence repairs that she shares whether I ask or not. Marlowe is more competent than me at certain things, and she'll tell me so. And Nell, he paused, and something happened in his face that was not quite a smile, but was in that territory. Nell will conduct a full inventory of your emotional state at the breakfast table if you give her the opportunity. That's a lot to walk into at 7 in the morning. There was a sound in the gallery, not laughters exactly, but the small shift of people acknowledging something true. But none of it, Silas said, is something I would trade. That's what I can tell you. If you're asking what those children are to me, they're mine to look after. That's how I understand it now. Not because of the paperwork, because that's what it became. Prescott said he had no further questions. Aldridge stood. He was shorter with Silas than he had been with Marlowe. He was clearly calibrating. Silas was harder to rattle, and he knew it. Came at the marriage timing again, briefly, and Silas confirmed the timeline without apology. Came at the length of the relationship. You have known these children 5 months, he said. Silas said yes. He asked whether 5 months was sufficient to claim the kind of bond Silas had described. I know what sufficient looks like. Silas said. I know what happened. I described what happened. You can decide whether that's sufficient. Aldridge changed direction. Mr. Boone, you testified that your late wife Eleanor maintained records for the ranch. Yes, and that you had not accessed those records since her death. Correct. You mentioned that Marlowe, your current wife, organized and cross-referenced those records for the land case. Is that accurate? Yes. And you found her ability to do that impressive. Silas saw where this was going. Yes. Would you say that your appreciation of Marlowe Bennett, at the time she was still Marlowe Bennett, grew significantly as a result of her contribution to your land case? It did so. The legal protection offered by marriage was mutually beneficial. She got legal standing. You got a capable partner whose skills had already proven valuable to your ranch. Silas looked at Aldridge. He said flatly, if you're suggesting I married her for the land work, that's not accurate. I married her because it was the right thing to do for her, and the girl's in a situation where someone was threatening to use the law against them. He paused. Whether she's also good at keeping records, that's a separate fact. Aldridge let that go and sat down. The recess that followed was 40 minutes. They sat in the hallway, Silas and Marlowe on one bench, Prescott pacing nearby, beside her mother with her hands folded in her lap. Marlowe hadn't said anything since leaving the stand. She was in the window-staring mode present, but inside herself, working through something. May said to Silas, you said you have the stone in your pocket. Still, you've had it since November? Yes. May looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then she said, I didn't know that. You didn't ask. I thought she stopped. Started again. I thought you kept it for a few days and then put it down somewhere. Nell gave it to me, Silas said. I kept it. May looked away. Her jaw was set in that way she had, the way that looked like stubbornness, but wasn't quite. It was something closer to the effort of not showing what she was feeling. Prescott came back. The judge wants to speak with May. Marlowe looked up. Privately, Prescott said, standard procedure with children in custody matters. He'll have a clerk present. It's not adversarial. He just wants to talk to her directly. Marlowe looked at May. May said, all right. She said it the same way she had said she would come with Silas through the blizzard that first night. Just all right. The decision made, the thing to be done. She went. The door closed behind her and the clerk and the judge. Silas and Marlowe sat in the hallway. Prescott sat beside them. Nobody said anything for a long time. Outside the courthouse window, a wagon went past, two men in it arguing about something, their voices carrying briefly and then fading as they moved on. Ordinary life, going somewhere else. She'll be all right, Marlowe said. She was saying it to herself more than to either of them. She knows what she wants to say, Silas said. She's 8. She's May, he said. Marlowe looked at him. After a moment, she almost smiled. Didn't fully form, but it came close. May was inside for 22 minutes. When the door opened and she came out, her face was unreadable in the careful way she had cultivated. She sat back down beside her mother, and Marlowe put her hand over May's, and May allowed it. Are you all right? Marlowe asked. Yes. What did he ask? He asked what I liked about living here. He asked what I missed about Missouri. She paused. He asked about Uncle Elias. What did you say? May was quiet for a moment. Told him the truth. Prescott looked at her carefully. About all of it? Yes. She looked down at her hands. Told him about Uncle Elias's house and how large it was. I told him I knew he wasn't a bad man, just one who wanted to be right about something. Told him. She stopped. I told him what I wrote in the letter, about the man who fixes the window so I don't wake up cold. The hallway was very quiet. Did he read the letter? Silas asked. He had it on his desk, May said. He didn't say whether he read it, but he had it. The afternoon session opened with Elias on the stand. He was what he had always been, composed, measured, presenting the story of a concerned uncle who wanted to honor his brother's memory. Spoke about Thomas with genuine-sounding grief, and Silas, watching him, thought that perhaps it was genuine. Perhaps Elias Whitmore truly believed all of it, that he was the aggrieved party, the responsible one, the man doing right by a dead brother's children. That made it no less dangerous. Prescott crossed him on the lean. Elias had been briefed that this was coming. His lawyers had clearly prepared him, and he answered carefully, describing the loan as a private family arrangement entered into when Thomas was struggling financially. He said Thomas had been clear-minded when he agreed to it. He said the formalization after Thomas's death had been a legal requirement of estate processing, nothing more. Prescott asked when specifically the loan had been verbally agreed to. Elias gave a date. Prescott asked whether Elias had any contemporaneous documentation of the agreement prior to Thomas's death. Any letter, any signed note, anything from before the estate filing. Elias said there had been an informal understanding between brothers. An informal understanding, Prescott said. No written record from before Thomas's death. It was a family matter, Elias said, conducted according to Dr. Hadfield's declaration, which is entered as Exhibit 7 during a period when Thomas Bennett's cognitive capacity was significantly compromised. Aldridge objected on the grounds of the declaration's scope. Judge Calver sustained it in part. Hadfield had stated his opinion, which was medical opinion, not legal determination. But Prescott had gotten the words into the room, and that was the point. Elias remained controlled throughout. He was not a man who broke under cross-examination. There were moments Prescott asked directly whether Elias had sought legal advice before Thomas's death regarding his potential rights to the children, and Elias paused just slightly too long before saying no, that the control cost him something. Pause. Silas saw it. Marlowe beside him went very still. Prescott saw it. He moved past it without pressing it, saving it for the closing, and Silas understood that Prescott was better at this than he'd given him credit for. Aldridge's closing was thorough. He walked through blood relation, the significance of family continuity for children who had lost their father, the shortness of the Wyoming household's history, the circumstances of the marriage. He was careful and he was good, and he made a coherent argument. Prescott's closing was shorter. He talked about evidence, talked about what the court had seen and heard. He walked through Hadfield's declaration and what it said about the lien, what it said about Thomas Bennett's capacity, what it said about the contested financial arrangement that underpinned Elias's claimed standing in the family. Then he said, "Your Honor, Elias Whitmore is Thomas Bennett's brother. That is the extent of his relationship to these children. He has not been present in their daily lives. He did not pull May Bennett through a Wyoming blizzard. He did not sit beside Nell Bennett while she arranged her stones by the fire. He did not repair the window frame so that an 8-year-old girl would not wake up cold." He paused. What the court has before it is not a choice between family and a stranger. It is a choice between a man who shares blood with these children and a man who has actually been there, every day. For 5 months that look, in the testimony this court has heard, very much like the beginning of a life. He sat down. Judge Calver looked at his papers for a moment. He said he would deliver his ruling in the morning. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon, mostly in silence. Marlowe sat beside Silas, and May sat behind them, and none of them had much to say that felt useful against the specific anxiety of waiting for a decision that was now entirely out of their hands. At the ranch they fed the cattle, collected Nell from the Aberfoyle farm. She had apparently spent the day teaching Mrs. Aberfoyle a complex stone sorting system, and was disappointed to be taken away before the project was complete, and made supper. The supper was functional, rather than good. Silas burned the corn, and Marlowe's biscuits came out denser than she intended, and nobody mentioned either failure, because they were all too tired to care. Nell, who had not been told the full weight of what the day had contained, ate her supper and talked about Mrs. Aberfoyle's cat, with the cheerful absorption of someone who had passed a satisfactory day and wanted to share it. Silas listened to the cat story with more attention than it technically required, because Nell's voice, talking about something entirely ordinary, was, in that particular moment, the most grounding thing available to him. After supper, May washed the dishes without being asked. She did a thorough job, more careful than usual, and Silas understood that she was doing what she always did under pressure, finding a task and executing it well. He dried, working beside her in the kitchen, in the same wordless coordination they'd developed over months of this. "You told the truth in there today," he said. "In everything you told me, you said that was the right thing." May didn't look up from the dish she was washing. "I told him you weren't perfect," she said. "What?" The judge asked if you ever made mistakes. I said yes. She rinsed the dish. I said you burned the corn sometimes, and you left tools in the rain at least twice that I saw, and you talked to the cattle like they could understand you. She handed him the dish. He asked if that bothered me. I said no. I said it made you easier to believe. Silas held the dish and didn't say anything for a moment. "Easier to believe," he repeated. "People who are too careful seem like they're performing," May said. She had clearly thought about this. "You weren't performing." So I told him that. He dried the dish. Set it on the shelf. "Thank you," he said. May handed him another dish. "You can thank me when we find out what he decides." The ruling came at 10 o'clock the next morning. They were back in the courthouse, same bench, same smell of old wood and lamp oil, the same profound ordinariness of a building, where extraordinary things happened with no adjustment to its appearance. Nell was again at the Aberfoyle farm, again engaged in some project whose incompleteness she had complained about in the wagon. Judge Calver came in and sat and looked at his papers and then at the room. He was not a dramatic man. He did not build to anything. He said what he had decided in the plain language he used for all decisions, and the plain language was this: Court found insufficient grounds to support the petitioner's claim of parental unfitness. Court found the contested lien to be of questionable standing in light of the medical declaration regarding the decedent's capacity. Court found no evidence that Marlowe Boone had acted against the interests of her children in relocating to Wyoming. Court found the current household Marlowe Boone, Silas Boone, May Bennett, and Nell Bennett to be stable, established, and operating in the children's best interests. The petition for custody was denied. Elias Whitmore sat very still on the other side of the room. He did not make a sound. He had the face of a man absorbing something he had not truly prepared for, despite everything. He had believed he was right. He had believed the law would see it his way. He was now understanding that these two things had not proven to be the same. Aldridge put his hand briefly on Elias's arm and said something quiet. Elias nodded. He did not look across the room. He gathered his papers and he left, and his lawyers followed, and the sound of their footsteps going down the courthouse hall was the last thing any of them heard of Elias Whitmore that day. Marlowe had both hands on the bench in front of her. Her knuckles were white. Then she let go. She didn't cry. She made a small sound, not a word, just an exhale, and then she pressed her hand briefly over her mouth, and then she dropped her hand, and she was composed again, or something close to it, the way a person is composed immediately after a very near thing. Prescott shook Silas's hand and said something about paperwork and follow-up documentation, and Silas heard about half of it. May was sitting beside her mother with her shoulder, touching Marlowe's shoulder, not dramatically, just there, the two of them in contact, the way people are when they have been through something together and the something is over. Silas sat and let the room settle around him. He thought about the stone in his coat pocket. He thought about 5 months that had looked, in Prescott's words, very much like the beginning of a life. He thought about an 8-year-old who had told a judge he was easier to believe because he wasn't performing. He had not known, in November, when he opened the door into the blizzard, that it was a door of a different kind, the kind you couldn't close again once you'd opened it, not because it was stuck, but because you no longer wanted to. He hadn't wanted to close it in a long time. He reached into his pocket and found the stone smooth on one side, rough on the other, the gray-white stripe running through it. He held it for a moment, then put it back. Outside the courthouse window, Wyoming spring was fully arrived, the sky a hard clean blue above the town, the kind of day that looked like the world had decided to cooperate. Prescott was saying something about filing the final paperwork by end of week. May was asking Marlowe if they could get Nell now. Silas stood up and put on his hat. They collected Nell from the Aberfoyle farm on the way back through town. She came running out of the farmhouse before the wagon had fully stopped, coat half on, stone pouch clinking at her belt, calling something about a cat that had climbed into a barrel and whether they could get a cat of their own because Mrs. Aberfoyle's cat was extremely talented, and it seemed wasteful not to have one at the ranch. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop, and May reached down and hauled her sister up onto the seat beside her. "Did it go all right?" Nell asked, looking between the adults. With the frank curiosity she applied to everything. "Yes," Marlowe said. Nell looked at her mother's face, reading it the way she read everything, with her whole attention, no pretense of subtlety. Then she nodded, satisfied with what she saw, and went back to the cat argument. May put her arm around Nell's shoulders, not making a thing of it. Just there. Silas clicked the horse forward and they drove home. The ranch looked different in spring. This was not sentiment. It was literal. The mud season had given way to something greener and more forgiving than anything November or December had offered. The south pasture was properly green now, the kind of green that Wyoming produced only briefly and brilliantly before the summer dried it back. Cattle moved differently in it, more slowly, more content, the winter's tension gone from the way they held themselves. The barn wall that Marlowe and Silas had reinforced in February stood solid against the warming air. The garden plot on the east side of the house, which Marlowe had turned and seeded 3 weeks ago, showed the first tentative rows of green coming up. Silas noticed all of this on the drive-in. He noticed it the way a person notices things that have changed while they were looking somewhere else. Not dramatically, just with the quiet recognition that the accumulation of small efforts had produced something. They unhitched the horse and put the wagon away, and then stood in the yard for a moment, the four of them, with the afternoon around them, and nothing immediately requiring attention. Nell said, "Can we have the cat?" "No," said Silas and Marlowe simultaneously. Nell looked between them with the expression of someone who had been outnumbered before and was recalibrating her approach. "What if it was a very small cat?" "Still no," Silas said. "What if I named it after a stone?" Nell May said, with the tone of an older sibling who has absorbed the outcome she wanted and is now ready to move forward with the rest of the day. "Come help me with the wood." Nell went, under protest, still constructing theoretical arguments for the cat as she walked. Marlowe watched them go. The evening light was long across the yard, the way it got in late spring when the days stretched past what felt reasonable. "She's not going to stop asking," Marlowe said. "I know," Silas said. "We might end up with a cat, probably." She looked at him. There was something lighter in her face than there had been in months. Not the relief exactly, though that was part of it, but something underneath the relief. The thing that comes after you've been braced for impact for so long that when the thing finally passes, your body doesn't know immediately what to do with itself. It was the beginning of something unwinding. "I want to write to Ada," she said. "Tonight, to tell her it went our way. She'll be glad to hear it." "She was brave," Marlowe said. "She signed that paper knowing Elias's lawyer had already come to her door. She's 78 years old and she signed it anyway." She paused. "I want her to know it mattered." "Write to her," Silas said. "She earned it." That night was the first in months that Marlowe didn't hear the legal papers rustling in her own head as she tried to sleep. The documents had been a kind of constant background noise since Elias's first letter arrived. The dates and the arguments and the paragraphs she'd memorized, running through them the way you run your tongue over a sore tooth, checking whether it still hurt. She'd gotten so used to the noise that she'd almost forgotten what quiet felt like. She lay in the dark, and the quiet was different now. Not empty, just clear, like a window after rain. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him the way she had been trying to think about him for 2 years. Not the version that the last year had produced, the frightened and diminished man who said things that left marks, but the earlier version, the one she had actually loved. The man who had been genuinely funny at the wrong moments, who had brought her wildflowers from a roadside without occasion because he'd seen them and thought of her, who had held May as a newborn with the terrified reverence of a man who understood he had been handed something he had no idea how to hold but was going to figure out. She grieved that man. She had never stopped grieving him, even when she was exhausted and running and too occupied with survival to sit with it properly. She also knew that she had built something here, that it was real, that it was not a betrayal of what she'd had before. It was just a different thing, a new thing, arrived at through difficult roads in a way that left its marks on everyone involved. Thought about what she would tell the girls when they were old enough to ask, and they would ask, May especially someday, when she was old enough to frame the question properly. She thought she would tell them, "Your life doesn't start over. Continues. Sometimes through places that are so hard you don't see how you'll come through them. But you do, and the coming through is part of who you are, and you don't have to be grateful for the hardness. You just have to know it didn't finish you." She fell asleep before 10 for the first time since January. 2 weeks after the hearing, Prescott rode out with the final paperwork. He had filed the documents confirming the ruling, confirming Silas's legal recognition as the girl's stepfather, confirming the dismissal of Elias's petition with no grounds for appeal on the points raised. He laid them on the kitchen table and went through each one, patient and thorough in the way he had been throughout. And when he finished, he folded his hands and said that as far as he was concerned, the matter was fully closed. "Any further action from Whitmore?" Silas asked. "I don't anticipate it. His Missouri lawyer wrote to my office to confirm they would not be pursuing appeal. Aldridge, his lead lawyer, good enough to know when a position is untenable." Prescott paused. "That's not to say Whitmore has made peace with it. Men like him don't always make peace with things. But the legal path is closed." Marlowe said, "Good." It was the most efficient expression of everything she'd been carrying for months. One word. Prescott almost smiled at it. After he left, Marlowe stood at the table with the paperwork for a long moment. Then she opened the drawer under the table, the one Eleanor's hands had opened probably 10,000 times before hers, and put the papers inside. Closed the drawer. That was that. Life settled in the way that life settles after crisis. Not immediately, not neatly, but in the gradual way that a house settles back into its frame after something has shaken it. The shaking was over. The frame held, and now the ordinary business of living resumed, which turned out to be its own complicated and particular thing. The bed frame Silas had promised May in December, and delivered eventually, in March turned out to have a squeak on the left side that May had mentioned twice. He fixed it on a Tuesday afternoon in May while she was at school, shimming the joint properly and testing it 3 times until it was silent. He didn't say anything about it when she came home. She tested it herself when she went to bed, bounced once, heard nothing, and came back out to where he was reading and said, "Thank you," without elaborating. He said, "You're welcome," without elaborating. That was how they operated, the two of them. They understood each other in the specific way of people who communicate primarily in the practical register, who say what they mean through what they notice and fix and provide, and who trust that the other person can read the language. Nell was a different operation entirely. Nell communicated in the fully verbal, fully emotional, fully immediate mode of a child who had not yet learned that some feelings were better kept interior. She told Silas in late May that he was her favorite person after Mama and May and Mrs. Aberfoyle's cat, which she had named privately and in her own mind despite the official no-cat policy. "You named Mrs. Aberfoyle's cat?" Silas said. "In my head," Nell said. "You can't stop me from naming things in my head." He conceded this point. She had also, somewhere in the weeks after the hearing, made a subtle shift in how she referred to him. Not in the big moments she didn't make an announcement, but in the small ones, the ones that came out without her thinking about it. She would say to Mrs. Aberfoyle or to the schoolyard children she'd started playing with when she accompanied May on some afternoons, "My father has a spotted cow named Herman," or "My father says limestone makes those stripes." She didn't ask anyone's permission. She just decided the way she decided everything, and that was the way it was. The first time Silas heard it, she said it to a boy in town who had asked whose ranch that was on the East Road. He didn't correct her. Stood there, and the word landed in him somewhere, and he did not correct her. Marlowe had been 2 steps away. She had heard it. She looked at Silas, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything about it, then or later. Some things didn't need to be processed out loud. Some things you just let be what they were. In June, a letter arrived from Missouri. Marlowe recognized the handwriting immediately. Not Elias's, not a lawyer's. Small and slightly cramped and familiar from 11 years of proximity. Ada Gresham. She read it at the table while May was doing arithmetic, and Nell was outside in the garden, which she had appointed herself to protect from something she called the bad beetles, category she had not fully defined but was confident she could identify on sight. Ada had heard. Word traveled in Jefferson City, apparently, and it had reached her through the church community she'd been part of for 40 years, which had its own efficient information network. She wrote, "I heard through Francis Bale that Elias's case came to nothing, and I want you to know I am glad and I am not sorry for one word I signed. You were always a good mother in a hard house, and anyone with eyes could see it. I hope Wyoming is treating you as you deserve." She also wrote, in the last paragraph, "Ada Gresham is old and slow, but she has not lost her sense. You did right to leave. I knew it when you went, and I know it now." Marlowe put the letter down. May was watching her from across the table. "Good news?" May asked. "Ada." Marlowe folded the letter carefully. "He's glad we're all right." May went back to her arithmetic. Then, without looking up, "I'm glad she signed the paper." "So am I. She was scared, I could tell from how you talked about it." A pause. "She did it anyway." "Yes, she did." May made a small sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement, just acknowledgement, and continued her arithmetic. Marlowe put Ada's letter in the drawer with the legal documents, not because it was official, but because it was something she wanted to keep, something she wanted to look at again someday, when she needed to be reminded of what courage actually looked like, not the dramatic kind, not the crisis kind, but the ordinary kind, the kind that belongs to a 78-year-old woman who signs a paper she was warned not to sign and goes on with her day. The summer moved through in the way Wyoming summers did, fast and bright, and not quite long enough, with an urgency to everything growing because the windows of growth were narrow, and the things that needed to happen before winter had to happen now. Silas worked from before dawn to after dusk through most of June and July. The cattle were moved to the summer pasture. The garden came in better than anyone had honestly expected, given that Marlowe had started it late, and the soil on the east side of the house was not ideal, and Nell had helped seed 2 rows that came up in a pattern that suggested she had interpreted the instructions creatively. Marlowe canned what she could and dried what she couldn't, and kept the kitchen organized with the systematic efficiency that had been present from her first morning on the ranch. She had also, over the summer months, gradually made the house hers in the way that you can only do by living in something long enough that you stop treating it as someone else's space. She rearranged the shelving in the main room. She put up a shelf above the fireplace for things May's best arithmetic paper, the first 3 stones from Nell's original collection that Nell had formally retired to display status, a small carving of a horse that Silas had made 20 years ago and hadn't known what to do with. She had found it in a box and put it on the shelf, and he had looked at it there and decided it looked right. There were still difficult days when Marlowe woke up with the weight of the past year pressing down before she was fully conscious. Days when some small thing, a tone of voice, a momentary misunderstanding about something domestic and trivial scraped against old nerves and produced more friction than the thing warranted. She and Silas argued, sometimes with genuine heat, and the arguments were not always clean or fair, and occasionally one or the other of them said something sharper than they'd intended, and had to come back to it later and acknowledge it. He was not easy to live with, fully. He was quiet in ways that sometimes felt like distance when they weren't. He was simply inside himself, working through whatever he was working through. And he had spent enough years alone that the instinct to verbalize his inner states was underdeveloped. She had to learn to ask directly what she'd once had to guess at from posture and expression, and he had to learn that she needed him to answer in more than 3 words. She was not easy to live with, fully. She was capable in ways that could shade into controlling when she was anxious. When the worry returned, she organized things, and sometimes the things she organized were things that didn't need organizing, and the organizing was really just the anxiety finding something to do with itself. He had to learn to recognize the difference between her natural competence and her anxious competence, because they looked similar from the outside but required different responses. They learned these things gradually, imperfectly, across the summer and into the fall, in the particular school of living with another person that has no curriculum and no schedule, and only the daily fact of each other to work from. It wasn't always good. It was mostly good. It was, Marlowe thought, on a September evening, watching Silas explain something to May at the fence line. May nodding with focused attention, Silas using his hands to indicate something about the cattle's movement patterns. It was real. It was genuinely, specifically, irreducibly real. And that was more than she had dared to plan for when she sat on that stagecoach in November and told herself she was simply looking for somewhere to land. May turned 9 in October. Marlowe made a cake that she'd been quietly planning for 3 weeks, using the last of the summer preserves as filling. It was not a beautiful cake. It listed slightly to the left, which May observed with scientific interest, and Nell found hilarious, and Silas claimed was intentional for aerodynamic reasons, which made no sense at all, and made May laugh despite herself. Silas gave her a book, not a schoolbook, a proper novel, purchased from the bookseller in Laramie, a thick one with a spine that cracked satisfyingly when you opened it. May turned it over in her hands and looked at the cover and looked at Silas. "You chose this?" she said. "She meant you specifically thought about what I would want." "The bookseller helped," he said. "But you went and asked." "Yes." May nodded. She held the book the way she held things she was going to take seriously. "Thank you. You've been reading that falling off one since November," he said. "That one will hold together longer." It was not a sentimental speech. It was a practical observation about book durability. May understood it exactly as he meant it, and valued it exactly as he'd offered it, which was to say he had noticed what she read and thought about what she needed and gone to the trouble of getting it. That was the whole thing. Nell, not to be outdone in the occasion, presented May with a stone. "The best one," Nell said, with the gravity of a person making a significant transfer of property. "The most striped. I've been keeping it separate. It's yours." May looked at the stone gray and white and finely striped, smooth on both faces. She looked at her sister. "Are you sure?" I decided, Nell said. May put the stone in her dress pocket. She kept it there for the rest of the day, and when she went to bed, Marlowe saw her set it on the shelf beside the window, next to the book, where she could see it first thing in the morning. November came back around. The anniversary of the blizzard arrived on a Thursday, and nobody mentioned it explicitly. But Silas noticed that Marlowe stood at the kitchen window longer than usual that morning, and he knew she was thinking about it, about the woman who had stood on his porch in the storm, about how far she was now from that woman, and how close she still was to her. He brought in the wood that morning, without asking. He filled the box completely and added extra, stacking it against the north wall, because the north wall chinkings was solid now, and held heat the way it should. Marlowe saw what he'd done when she came back to the kitchen, and she looked at the wood, and she looked at him. And she said nothing, but her face said everything available. Later that day, the first serious snow of the new winter came. It was not a blizzard, nothing like what had come the year before. Just a steady, quiet snowfall that settled on the land with the patient efficiency of a Wyoming winter establishing itself. Cattle were already in the near pasture. The barn was stocked. The north wall was solid. The house was warm. Silas was at the fence line when it started, checking the gate latch he'd been meaning to get to all week. He finished the job in the first light snow and walked back to the house and stamped the snow off his boots on the porch and came inside to find the kitchen occupied. Marlowe was at the stove. May was at the table with the thick novel open and her arithmetic next to it, apparently attempting to do both at once with the limited success that effort typically produced. Nell was on the floor beside the fireplace, with her stones laid out in a new configuration she was clearly mid-thought about, moving them in small adjustments and frowning at the results. Silas took off his coat and hung it on the hook. Nell looked up. Herman was watching the snow, she said. I saw him from the window. He looked confused. He's not confused, Silas said. He just doesn't like it. How do you know? Because he's done it every November for 3 years. Nell considered this. Maybe he forgets every year, maybe Silas said. He didn't think Herman forgot. He thought some creatures simply never made peace with certain things, and that was their nature. And you accounted for it and moved on. He sat at the table. Marlowe brought coffee without being asked because she knew by now that he wanted it when he came in from the cold. He took it, and she sat across from him with her own, and they were quiet together in the kitchen while the snow fell outside. And May read and did arithmetic, and Nell periodically repositioned a stone with the expression of someone making adjustments to a complex system. I've been thinking about the east fence, Marlowe said. I know. The third post is pulling. It'll need to come out and be reset before spring. I know, I'll get to it. I'm just saying, I know you are. She looked at him over her coffee. He looked back. There was a version of this exchange that would have been an argument. Had been an argument, in fact, twice over the summer. And there was a version of it that was simply two people who knew the same piece of land and thought about its problems simultaneously and said so. They had arrived, somewhere over the past 12 months, at the second version more often than the first. I wrote to Ada again, Marlowe said. Asked if she'd like to visit. I know she can't make the journey alone, but she has a niece in Denver. I thought perhaps send the niece the train fare, Silas said. Marlowe looked at him. If that's what it takes, he said. She looked at him a moment longer in the particular way she had, the look that was deciding something, or acknowledging something already decided. All right, she said. I'll write to the niece. May looked up from her book. Who's coming? No one yet, Marlowe said. It's just a plan. Is it Ada? May asked. If everything works out. May nodded and went back to her book, satisfied. Nell said, without looking up from her stones, Can she bring the cat? No, said 3 voices at once. Nell sighed with the full-body resignation of the persistently outnumbered and returned to her configuration. That evening, after the girls were in bed, Silas sat by the fire with the book he'd been working through since August, a slow reader, always had been, but a thorough one, and Marlowe sat at the table with Ada's letter drafting the follow-up she'd mentioned. The house was quiet in the way it was quiet now. Not empty quiet, not the quiet that had weight and ache, but the quiet of people who had all found their places and were in them. The fire ticked. The snow pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the back room, May's book slid off the bed. She had a habit of reading until she fell asleep and dropping it, and then was still. Silas looked up from his book. He looked at Marlowe writing at the table. He looked at the shelf above the fireplace with its small collection of things. He looked at the door of the back room where the girls slept, and thought about Nell's stone pouch on the table beside her bed, and May's new book on the shelf, and the perfectly striped stone May had, been given at her birthday and kept beside the window. He thought about the stone in his coat pocket, still there. He had not moved it since November of the year before. He thought about what it meant to be given a thing by a child who told you she had decided. It meant she had looked at you and decided you were someone worth giving something to. It meant she had made that calculation at 5 years old and stuck with it. There was no sentimentality in it, no adult softening. It was simply the most direct and honest form of trust available. Here, I decided, this is yours. He put his book down. Marlowe. She looked up from her letter. I need to say something, he said. Put her pen down. She had learned over the year to recognize when he was saying something he had been working up to. It didn't happen often. When it did, it was worth attending to. When you arrived here, he said, I was angry about the letters, about what you left out. I want you to know I understand it now in a way I didn't then. You were running. You needed someone to say yes. You couldn't risk the honest thing. He paused. I don't know that I would have said yes. I'd like to think I would have, but I can't be certain. Still, what I know, he said, is that it worked out the way it needed to work out. Not because it was easy or because anyone was lucky. Because you walked through a blizzard with your daughter. Because May found a box of records that saved this ranch. Because you organized everything that needed organizing when I was too alone to see it clearly. Because gave me a stone and decided it was mine. He looked at her. I don't say things like this easily, but I want you to know that I'm not sorry about any of it. Not the start, not the difficulty, none of it. Marlowe looked at him across the table. The fire, the snow, the quiet house with 2 children sleeping in the back. I'm not sorry either, she said. Her voice was steady and true. Not about any of it. That was the extent of the speech. Neither of them was capable of more. They were not people built for long declarations, and they had learned each other well enough to know that the words said were the words meant, and the brevity was not inadequacy, but precision. He picked his book back up. She picked her pen back up. They stayed like that for another hour in the firelight, the snow falling outside, the house holding them in the particular way that a house holds the people who have chosen it. Not perfectly, not magically, but solidly, the way things hold when they've been put together with care over time and tested and have not come apart. There is something that stories like this one tend to leave out, in the interest of resolution. They leave out the third fence post problem, which Silas did get to in April, and which was worse than expected and required 3 days and the help of a neighbor. They leave out the November that Nell had an ear infection that lasted 2 weeks, and nobody slept properly, and Silas drove to town twice in bad weather for medicine, and came back each time looking like a man who would not discuss the drive. They leave out the argument in December, a real one, with real heat about something so trivial in retrospect that Marlowe couldn't fully reconstruct it afterward. Only that it was about the kitchen shelving, and became about something else entirely, and required 2 days of careful navigation before they found their way back. They leave out that May, at 11, went through a period of pulling away, not dramatically, but in the quiet way of a child becoming a person, establishing the distance she needed to figure out who that person was. She was shorter with everyone for 6 months, including Silas, and he let her be short with him, without retreating, which seemed to be the right approach, because at some point the distance reduced on its own, and she came back, slightly more herself than she'd been before. They leave out that Marlowe sometimes woke in the night and thought about Thomas. Not every night, sometimes, and worked through the complicated grief of a person who loved someone who hurt them, and has had to sit with both of those things being true simultaneously, and find a way to understand herself in the middle of them. These are the things stories leave out. But the shape of a life isn't made of its resolved moments. It's made of the ongoing work, the fence posts and the medicine runs, and the arguments about shelving, and the distance that teenagers need, and the complicated nights. The resolved moments are just the places where you can see the shape clearly for a second before the next thing arrives. What was true by the following spring, and the spring after that, was this. Silas Boone's ranch was no longer a quiet place, and he had stopped wanting it to be. The house had the particular texture of a house that held more than one life, the clutter of May's schoolwork and Nell's stones, and Marlowe's organized systems overlapping with the boots by the door and the saddle rig on the workbench, and the small carved horse on the fireplace shelf. It was full of the friction and warmth of people who had chosen to be in the same space and were managing that choice daily, with varying degrees of grace. Nell got the cat in the end. This was perhaps inevitable. She named it after a stone schist, which nobody could pronounce correctly the first time, which she found very funny, and it lived for 14 years and had the territorial confidence of an animal that knows it has prevailed. May became, eventually, a woman who knew exactly how land records worked and how to read a survey document and what questions to ask a lawyer, and she used this knowledge in ways that would have surprised nobody who had watched her. At 8 years old, identifying the relevant notation in a box under a window bench. She carried the striped stone in her pocket for years. Marlowe wrote to Ada every month without fail. Ada's niece did come to visit twice, with Ada, and the old woman sat in the kitchen and told stories about Missouri winters and ate Marlowe's bread and told Silas, with the directness of the very old, that he had a good face, and she was glad her neighbor had found him. Silas thanked her and meant it. Elias Whitmore did not write and did not come back. There was a report, Years later, through Missouri channels, that he had sold his property in Jefferson City and moved east. Whether he made peace with what the judge decided, whether he understood what he had really been chasing when he came to Wyoming, was something nobody could say. Some questions about other people's interiors remain open. You can only account for your own. And Silas. Silas Boone had expected, when he sent that letter to the matrimonial agency, something workable, practical arrangement, someone to share the weight of the ranch and the silence of the house. He had expected something functional and was prepared to be content with functional. What he received was 4 places at the table and arguments about kitchen shelving and a child who decided things by announcement and a girl who fixed windows in her head before she said them out loud and a woman who walked blizzards and organized boxes of documents and told him uncomfortable truths in the specific, precise way of someone who trusted him with the real version. He had expected a bride. He had not expected a family. There is a particular kind of gift that arrives in the wrong shape, at the wrong time, through the wrong door, and looks nothing like what you ask for, and turns out to be the thing you actually needed, which is a different thing from what you wanted, and a better thing than what you planned. You don't recognize it at the time. You recognize it later, sitting by a fire in November with snow at the windows, and a woman writing letters across the table, and a child's laughter coming from the back room, over something you'll have to ask about in the morning. You recognize it by the fact that when you look up from your book and take in the room, you don't feel the weight of the quiet anymore. You feel instead the particular warmth of a house that has been claimed, not by one person, but by several, working at it daily, imperfectly, together. That is the whole of it. That is everything.